The sun hangs low over the hills of Ravenna, casting long amber rays across the marshlands and painting the canals in liquid gold. The once vibrant heart of the Western Roman Empire pulses faintly, a ghost of former glory, as soldiers in tattered cloaks march silently through the city's fading streets. Their boots splash through shallow puddles, echoes of empire dissipating in the murk of history. The Roman world, once. This is not merely a story of conquest, or even of political upheaval. It is a story of legacy, of betrayal, of ambition wrapped in the language of legitimacy, of two men bound by fate in the turbulent vacuum left by Rome's collapse. One, a soldier who clawed his way up from the ranks to wear a crown not meant for him. The other, a prince born of the steppes and bred in the court of Constantinople, carrying both sword and scripture. Odoacer, Theodoric. One falls, and in that fall, the shape of the world changes. History rarely offers us clean endings, and even less frequently does it allow us to witness true beginnings. But in the cold winter of 493 AD, as the last Western emperor's memory fades into legend, a singular and brutal moment becomes a hinge between epochs. The murder of a king, the rise of another, the end of an experiment in shared rule, and the start of something far more enduring and complex. To understand this moment, we must step back, not just to the battlefield or the throne room, but into the hearts of men who lived in a world unraveling. Rome's collapse was not a sudden thunderclap but a slow, aching descent. Cities shrank, trade faltered, armies became private, laws regional, and the line between Roman and barbarian blurred beyond recognition. Yet the dream of Rome, its language, its law, its aura of authority, lived on. And it was into this fragile, fractured dream that Odoacer stepped. A man of mysterious origin, perhaps of Syrian blood, perhaps of mixed descent, Odoacer seized Rome's destiny with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that symbols mattered more than ceremonies. In 476, he deposed Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor, the empire's final ghost, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring he would now rule Italy in the Eastern emperor's name. But he wore no imperial title himself. He was not Augustus, nor Caesar. He was Rex, king, a title at once barbarian and deeply Roman in its new context. And for nearly 2 decades, he held Italy in a fragile balance, preserving Roman institutions while ruling with his own soldiers and sense of justice. But power in the shadow of empire is never secure. To the east, in the marble halls of Constantinople, Emperor Zeno viewed Odoacer with cautious contempt. A usurper, a barbarian who ruled too independently. And when an opportunity arose to unseat him, Zeno turned not to legions, but to another outsider, a young Gothic warrior he had once hosted at his court, Theodoric, son of Theodomir, heir to the Ostrogothic legacy. Theodoric was no mere tribal chieftain. Raised as a political hostage in Constantinople, he had absorbed Roman customs, Roman speech, Roman ambition, yet he remained, at heart, a Goth, bound to his people, loyal to their gods and their grievances. He was a man of two worlds. And it was this duality that made him dangerous and irresistible to an emperor who wished to rid himself of Odoacer without soiling imperial hands. So Zeno extended a brutal invitation: invade Italy, depose Odoacer, and rule in the emperor's name. Legitimacy by proxy, a Roman crown for a Gothic sword. Theodoric accepted, not just as a warrior, but as a man with a vision. He would not destroy Rome. He would protect it. In his mind, the Gothic might and Roman mind could forge a new synthesis. And so he led his people, tens of thousands of warriors and families alike, on a great migration. A second Gothic wave crashing down on Italy's weakened shores. What followed was no quick conquest. Odoacer resisted. For years, cities were besieged, alliances forged and broken, food grew scarce, and Italy bled. The Roman dream teetered on a knife's edge. But in the end, Theodoric prevailed. In 493, the two kings agreed to peace. They would rule together, share power from Ravenna, but in a moment as symbolic as it was savage. Theodoric invited Odoacer to a banquet, clasped his hand, and struck him down with a blade concealed beneath his robes. Some say he split the man from collarbone to hip. There is no sharing the rule of the world. Theodoric was said to have whispered. And with that, the last barrier fell. But this was no mere murder. It was the beginning of something new. A Gothic king on Italian soil. A barbarian ruling like a Roman. A new kingdom forged not in rebellion, but in fusion. Theodoric did not burn Rome. He restored its aqueducts. He did not dissolve its senate. He consulted it. He did not erase Roman law. He upheld it, even while maintaining Gothic customs for his own people. And in this balancing act, a new world was born. This is the story we will explore together. The twilight of Odoacer. The ascent of Theodoric. And the world they shaped between the ruins of one empire and the birth of another. A story not of ruin alone, but of resilience, not of collapse, but of continuity. Through betrayal and vision, through blood and marble, we will walk the streets of Ravenna and Rome, ride with Gothic horsemen, and sit in the candle-lit chambers where new laws and old loyalties clashed. The empire may be gone, but its shadow stretches long into the Middle Ages, and the ghosts of men like Odoacer and Theodoric still whisper to us across the centuries. The dawn breaks quietly over Ravenna. You stand at the edge of the city, its marshlands shimmering under the soft light of morning. This ancient capital, nestled between water and stone, once pulsed with the heartbeats of Roman emperors. Now, in this twilight of empire and emergence of new kingdoms, Ravenna belongs to another, Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, but he is more than a Gothic conqueror. He is, in every meaningful sense, a Roman, and yet, not entirely. Theodoric's story begins far from Ravenna, in the shadow of Constantinople's great domes, where he spent his youth as a hostage, a diplomatic pawn in the tense game between Gothic chieftains and Roman emperors. From his earliest years, he learned the language of Cicero, the customs of the Senate, and the subtle machinery of Roman administration. But his blood, his bones, those belonged to the Goths, a people hardened by migration, war, and exile, a people who had seen empires fall. By the time Theodoric returned to his people in the rugged lands north of the Danube, he was both outsider and insider, Roman educated, Gothic born. His dual identity would shape every decision he would make in the decades to come. It would also become his greatest strength, and his greatest burden. When Theodoric entered Italy in 488 CE, it was a land broken by war and betrayal. Odoacer, the Syrian warlord who had deposed the last Western Roman emperor in 476, now ruled in the name of the Eastern Court. Though the Emperor Zeno barely tolerated him, his rule was pragmatic, even effective at times, but it was also fragile. Roman senators viewed him with suspicion. The Eastern Court viewed him as a rebel. The remnants of Roman military order viewed him with resentment. Theodoric, sent by Zeno to depose Odoacer, marched into Italy not only as a warrior but as an emissary of Rome, or so he claimed. His Gothic warriors, many of whom had grown up amidst the dislocation of collapsing frontiers and shifting allegiances, saw opportunity, a fertile land, a weakened enemy, and the promise of settlement. The war between Theodoric and Odoacer lasted nearly 5 years. It was a brutal, A attritional campaign marked by shifting alliances and broken truces. The climactic moment came in 493 CE, when the two leaders agreed to a peace banquet in Ravenna. There, Theodoric extended his hand in friendship, and then buried a blade in Odoacer's body. It was not personal. Theodoric would later tell a Roman senator. It was necessary. For order. For Rome. The massacre of Odoacer's followers that followed was horrifying, a cleansing of opposition. Swift and final. But to Theodoric, this bloodshed was not barbarism. It was politics, the Roman way. With Odoacer gone, Theodoric became the undisputed master of Italy. But he did not crown himself emperor. He did not mint coins with his own face. Nor did he dissolve the Senate or abandon Roman law. Instead, he walked a tightrope suspended between two worlds. He styled himself Rex, not Imperator. In public proclamations, he referred to himself as Patricius Romanus, a Roman patrician. He retained the Senate in Rome, even elevating Roman aristocrats like Boethius and Cassiodorus to high office. He honored the Roman calendar, repaired aqueducts, and restored the grandeur of public buildings left in ruins by decades of neglect. Yet he remained, at his core, a Gothic warlord. His army spoke Gothic. His personal guard followed Gothic law. His royal court in Ravenna reflected the culture of the forested north. With feasting halls and Gothic songs echoing through marble corridors built by emperors. Theodoric ruled not through assimilation, but through coexistence. One system for the Romans, one for the Goths, two legal codes, two traditions, one kingdom. This balancing act, precarious, brilliant, defined his reign. To the Roman aristocracy, Theodoric was an enigma. Boethius, that last great philosopher of the ancient world, served him loyally, for a time. He praised the king's dedication to justice and learning. In Theodoric's court, he saw hope. That perhaps the Gothic tide could be channeled into Roman forms. That civilization might survive its conquerors. But when accusations of treason reached the king's ears, Theodoric acted with sudden cruelty. Boethius was imprisoned, tortured, and executed, his body broken in a cell once graced by philosophy. Theodoric never forgot he was ruling a conquered people. Mercy was dangerous. Loyalty was never guaranteed. Still, his commitment to Roman infrastructure remained unshaken. He invested in roads, grain distribution, and public works. Cities like Milan and Naples began to revive. Trade routes, long shattered by war, slowly reopened. Grain shipments from Sicily nourished the people of Rome. And in Ravenna, Theodoric erected some of the most stunning monuments of late antiquity, churches and mausoleums adorned with glittering mosaics. Christian in content but Roman in form. Gothic in patronage. One such structure, the Mausoleum of Theodoric, still stands today. It is a symbol of his paradox. A tomb for a barbarian king built with the precision of Roman engineering, crowned with a single stone dome weighing over 230 tons. Placed without mortar, still whole after 1500 years. What was Theodoric building? A Gothic kingdom? A Roman revival? Or a third thing, a synthesis? Fleeting but radiant? Religion posed a persistent problem. Theodoric, like many Goths, was an Arian Christian, a doctrine considered heretical by the Catholic Church since the Council of Nicaea. His subjects, especially in the southern cities, were fiercely Catholic, though Theodoric generally tolerated religious difference, famously insisting on freedom of conscience. Suspicion never fully vanished. Whispers in Rome accused him of undermining orthodoxy. Clerics in Constantinople questioned his legitimacy. To complicate matters, the Eastern Empire under Emperor Anastasius, and later Justin I never truly recognized Theodoric's authority. Officially, he was a viceroy, a ruler in the emperor's name. In reality, he governed as an independent king. This diplomatic ambiguity grew dangerous. In the final years of his reign, as tensions with Constantinople grew, Theodoric's paranoia deepened. He cracked down on dissent. Executions increased. Roman elites who once praised him fell silent. The balance was tipping, too Gothic for the Romans, too Roman for the Goths. And yet, even now, scholars look back on his reign as a golden moment, a brief reprieve in the long unraveling of the West. His 33 years on the throne brought stability, order, and a sense of continuity to a land exhausted by collapse. He showed that a barbarian king could be a patron of Romanitas, that the old ways could be carried forward, not merely destroyed. After his death in 526, chaos returned swiftly. His daughter Amalasuntha attempted to preserve his legacy but was murdered by Gothic rivals. The Eastern Empire saw its chance. Justinian launched his grand reconquest. Italy bled. Cities were ruined. The careful balance Theodoric had maintained was shattered by war. In hindsight, his reign appears all the more luminous, not because it lasted, but because it almost did. You find yourself again in Ravenna, walking beneath mosaics of Christ Pantocrator and Roman emperors, their golden eyes watching from centuries past. In this place, Theodoric's dream still flickers, the dream that Rome and the Goths could inhabit the same world, not as enemies but as partners in civilization. It was a fragile dream, born in compromise and ambition, killed by politics and fear. But it mattered, because in Theodoric's balancing act, we glimpse something rare in history, not the rise or fall of an empire, but the attempt, sincere, imperfect, glorious, to reconcile old and new, to be both conqueror and custodian, to carry the weight of a broken world and still build something beautiful from its ruins. That is his legacy, not just as a king, but as a bridge. A Gothic king, a Roman patron, a man who stood between two worlds, and for a moment, held them both. Theodoric's Ravenna stood serene in marble and mosaic, a city of light on the edge of empire. But behind the golden tiles and carefully preserved Roman columns lay deep fractures. Not of stone, but of faith. Religion in the 6th century was not merely a matter of personal belief. It was political, cultural, even existential. It could unite peoples across empires or tear them apart within a single household. And in the years following the Western Empire's disintegration, the Christian world was increasingly divided, not just between Catholic and Arian, but between East and West, imperial orthodoxy and regional identity, bishop and emperor. Theodoric stood uneasily at the center of that divide. He was an Arian Christian, a faith condemned as heresy by the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD and reaffirmed as such by the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Arianism taught that Christ was not co-eternal with the Father, but a created being, divine. Yes, but subordinate. For Orthodox Catholic bishops in Rome and Constantinople, this was a dangerous distortion of Christian truth. But for many Germanic peoples, including the Goths, the Vandals, and the Burgundians, Arianism was their faith, often inherited through centuries of missionary activity in the Roman frontier. Thus, when Theodoric ruled Italy, he did so as a heretic, in the eyes of his subjects and the imperial court alike. And yet, paradoxically, his rule marked one of the most religiously tolerant periods in post-Roman Europe. Theodoric understood the dangers of religious conflict. Perhaps it was his time in Constantinople that taught him, the sight of priests brawling in the streets over Christological disputes, or bishops imprisoned for opposing imperial theology. Perhaps it was pragmatic politics, recognizing that a Gothic elite ruling over a Catholic majority required careful management. Or perhaps it was personal. He may have believed, sincerely, that the divine was too vast to be monopolized by a single doctrine. In a letter to the Senate, Theodoric wrote, "We cannot command faith, for faith is a matter of will, not compulsion. Let each man worship as he believes. And let none be persecuted for the manner in which he honors God." Such sentiments were remarkable for their time, even radical. He allowed the Catholic Church in Italy to function freely. Bishops were elected without royal interference. Church property was protected. Roman ecclesiastical courts remained active. Pope Symmachus, embroiled in political conflict with rival claimants, found in Theodoric an unlikely protector. To many Italians, Theodoric was not a religious tyrant, but a guarantor of stability. But not all trusted this fragile peace. In Constantinople, where the emperor saw himself as the guardian of orthodoxy, Theodoric's Arianism cast a long shadow. Officially, he ruled as a viceroy under the Eastern Emperor. In practice, he was a sovereign king. This contradiction rankled the imperial court, especially under emperors like Anastasius and later Justin I, who were deeply concerned with theological purity and political control. Theodoric's letters to Constantinople are filled with a tone of cautious diplomacy, stressing his loyalty, his care for Roman traditions, his moderation in faith. But the tone from Constantinople grew colder over time. The tension reached a boiling point with the accession of Emperor Justin in 518, a fervent Catholic who began persecuting Arians in the East and dismissing Gothic envoys. Theodoric, now in his final years, watched with growing alarm. He saw a campaign of pressure forming, not through armies, but through bishops, letters, and law. His people, the Goths, had been tolerated so long as they ruled quietly. But now the rules were changing. A whisper of fear grew in Ravenna. Would the emperor move against Theodoric? Would he declare a crusade of orthodoxy? Theodoric responded with suspicion, and then repression. In 523, Theodoric arrested Boethius, the philosopher and senator, a man of profound intellect and one of the last great representatives of classical Roman learning, had served loyally for years. But when accusations arose that Boethius was corresponding with the Eastern court, Theodoric believed them, or at least chose to. Whether Boethius was truly guilty is unclear. What is clear is the brutality that followed. He was imprisoned, denied trial, and eventually executed, bludgeoned to death in a cell in Pavia. His father-in-law, Symmachus, was also killed. The executions shocked the Roman elite and horrified the church. Theodoric, once a model of tolerance, now seemed a paranoid tyrant. Boethius, in prison, composed his masterpiece, The Consolation of Philosophy. It is a book of quiet despair and luminous hope, written as death approached, framed as a dialogue with Lady Philosophy herself. In it, Boethius says nothing of Christ, nor of politics, but the shadow of Theodoric lies across every page. The tensions soon reached Pope John I. In 525, Theodoric sent the Pope himself to Constantinople, as an envoy, under duress, to negotiate better treatment for Arians in the Eastern Empire. It was a bold and dangerous mission. John was welcomed with honors in the East but failed to extract concessions. Upon his return to Italy, Theodoric accused him of betrayal. The Pope was imprisoned and died soon after, likely of mistreatment. With that, the mask was gone. Theodoric's rule, once seen as a brilliant balance, now showed its cracks. The old king died shortly after. In 526, some whispered it was divine punishment for his crimes. Others said he saw a vision of the dead Pope John before the end, silent, accusing. Yet even after Theodoric's death, the religious divide he navigated remained unresolved, and grew more dangerous. In Italy, the Gothic elite remained Arian, the Roman population, Catholic. In Constantinople, Justinian, Justin's nephew and successor, prepared for war. He had a vision to reunify the empire under one emperor, one law, and one faith. The religious difference became not just a matter of doctrine but a justification for conquest. When Justinian launched his invasion of Italy in 535, he framed it not only as a military operation but as a holy mission to restore orthodoxy, to rescue the Catholics from heretical rule. It was propaganda, certainly, but it resonated, and it revealed the lasting power of theological division in shaping imperial policy. But history would prove more complicated. Justinian's campaigns devastated Italy, regardless of creed. Cities burned, churches collapsed, Catholic, Arian, and pagan alike suffered. The dream of religious unity came at enormous cost. And Arianism? It would fade, not through swords, but through time. The Gothic kingdom fell. The Vandals were conquered. The Burgundians converted. In Gaul, Clovis had already embraced Catholicism. Slowly, over generations, the Germanic peoples who once held to Arian belief entered the Catholic fold. But the deeper lesson of Theodoric's era, the fragility of religious peace, the cost of dogma, the human toll of zeal, remained. You walk again in Ravenna. The churches still stand. In San Vitale, golden mosaics shimmer. One depicts Theodoric's palace empty of figures, the king erased after his fall. Another shows Emperor Justinian in triumph, surrounded by priests and soldiers. He brought orthodoxy, he brought unity, but he also brought ruin. And somewhere in between those images, in the silence between mosaic tiles, lies Theodoric's truth. He tried, for a time, to hold two worlds together. To rule as a heretic in the eyes of some, a savior in the eyes of others. To keep the peace between Rome and Ravenna, Constantinople and Milan, bishop and warrior. In the end, it was not enough. But for those brief years, his balancing act offered a fragile, luminous hope that faith need not divide, that difference need not lead to destruction, that a Gothic king could honor Roman gods and laws without shedding blood for belief. It is a hope worth remembering. The winter winds swept across the valleys of Gaul, cold and unforgiving, as if echoing the tremors of a crumbling world. Once a realm of imperial grandeur, Gaul in the late 5th century was a fractured tapestry, villas crumbling into weeds, Roman baths left in ruin, legions long since vanished. The Western Empire was gone, the shadow of Rome retreating across mountains and rivers. In its place, kings had risen, barbarian kings, warlords cloaked in the remnants of Roman power. Among them, none rose higher than a warrior from the Merovingian line, a young and cunning chief of the Salian Franks named Clovis. Clovis was no ordinary chieftain. Born around 466, he inherited leadership at the tender age of 15 after the death of his father. Childeric I. His people, the Salian Franks, were fierce and proud. Settled near Tournai, in the northern reaches of Roman Gaul, they had long served as foederati, allies of Rome in name, independent in practice. But Clovis had greater ambitions than mere survival. He saw that the Roman world was dead, its husk hollowed out by decades of internal decay and external invasions. He also saw something else: opportunity. Where others scavenged Rome's carcass, Clovis envisioned a kingdom built not on ashes, but on unity, a new kind of power, forged through conquest and faith. His rise began with war. Clovis knew the map of Gaul was a chessboard of weak rivals: Visigoths to the south, Burgundians to the southeast, Alemanni across the Rhine. The Romans who remained clung to their cities like relics, unable to mount meaningful resistance. Clovis struck hard and fast. He defeated the Roman general Syagrius, often called the King of the Romans, at the Battle of Soissons in 486. With Syagrius fled and his territory absorbed, Clovis became master of northern Gaul. But conquest was only part of the plan. He ruled over a patchwork of peoples: pagan Franks, Christian Gallo-Romans, remnants of Roman administration, tribal warlords, bishops. If he was to rule effectively, he needed not just a sword, but a symbol, something that could bind these disparate strands into a single fabric. That symbol would be the church. Clovis, like most of his warriors, was a pagan, reverent toward the gods of war and the thunderer, rooted in ancestral rites. But his wife, Clotilda, was different. She was a Burgundian princess, and a devout Catholic Christian, a woman of strong faith. Clotilda prayed constantly for her husband's conversion, urging him to abandon his idols and receive baptism. At first, Clovis resisted. The gods of his ancestors had brought him victory. Why abandon them? What strength did the crucified God of the Romans offer that Odin or Thor had not already provided? Yet in 496, on the battlefield against the Alemanni at Tolbiac, something changed. According to Gregory of Tours, the chronicler bishop whose history of the Franks would later immortalize the moment, Clovis cried out in desperation during the battle, "O Jesus Christ, whom Clotilda says is the Son of the living God, if you grant me victory over these enemies, I will believe in you and be baptized in your name." Victory followed, and with it, a new faith. That same year, Clovis was baptized in Reims by Bishop Remigius, along with thousands of his warriors. It was no small affair. Baptism, in late antiquity, was not a mere ritual of water and oil. It was a transformation, a rejection of the old world and an entry into a new one. When Clovis emerged from the font, dripping with sanctified water, he was no longer just a Frankish king. He was God's king, and this changed everything. While other barbarian rulers, like the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, had adopted Arian Christianity, placing them at odds with the Catholic majority, Clovis embraced Nicene orthodoxy. In doing so, he aligned himself with the Gallo-Roman population, with the Catholic bishops, and with the prestige of Roman spiritual authority. He was, in the words of Gregory, a new Constantine. The alliance between Clovis and the Catholic Church was more than symbolic. It was strategic. Catholic bishops in Gaul had long feared Arian domination. The Visigoths in Toulouse and the Burgundians in Lyon were powerful and heretical. From a Catholic perspective, Clovis' conversion offered them hope. At last, here was a king who shared their creed, who might defend orthodoxy and protect their flocks. In return, Clovis gained the moral legitimacy of the Church. Roman bishops blessed his reign. Gallo-Roman aristocrats entered his service. The Latin-speaking population, once loyal to distant emperors, now found a champion in their new Catholic king. This marriage of Frankish sword and Roman altar forged something entirely new, a hybrid order. Neither fully barbarian nor fully Roman. It was the beginning of post-Roman Catholic kingship in the West. Clovis was not content to convert. He acted swiftly to extend his power under the banner of orthodoxy. In 507, he turned his eyes south, to the rich lands of Aquitaine and the powerful Visigothic kingdom centered in Toulouse. Their king, Alaric II, was an Arian, and thus a religious enemy. A heretic in the eyes of Catholic Gaul. Clovis declared war. The Battle of Vouillé followed, a brutal contest between two worlds. The Visigothic army was formidable, but the momentum was with Clovis. According to legend, he killed Alaric with his own hands. Whether or not this is true, the outcome was clear. The Visigothic hold on southern Gaul was broken. Toulouse was taken. Aquitaine was absorbed. Clovis emerged not only as a conqueror but as a defender of the true faith. The Catholic bishops rejoiced. So did the Eastern Emperor. From Constantinople, Emperor Anastasius sent Clovis the insignia of a Roman consul, a symbolic gesture, acknowledging his authority and Christian leadership. It was a moment rich in irony. A pagan Frank, now baptized, wielding Roman titles as a reward for defeating fellow Germanic rulers who had embraced a heretical version of Christianity. In Clovis, the ghost of Roman order lived on, not in marble palaces, but in tribal halls echoing with Latin prayers. But Clovis was not without his darker side. He could be ruthless, even with his own blood. In the years following his southern victories, he moved to consolidate power internally. Frankish custom had long emphasized shared rule among royal kin, brothers, cousins, sons, each receiving part of the inheritance. But Clovis, with Roman-style kingship in mind, wanted singular authority. He orchestrated the murder of rival Frankish leaders, including relatives, ensuring that his sons would inherit a united kingdom. Gregory of Tours, though a Christian bishop, reports these acts with uneasy reverence. Clovis eliminated his enemies one by one, yet he said, "Woe to me, who have lost all my kin." But though he wept, he ruled alone. Thus began the Merovingian dynasty, a blood-soaked beginning for what would become the most powerful royal house in early medieval Europe. Clovis died in 511, at the age of 45, leaving behind a kingdom far larger and more cohesive than the one he had inherited. He had defeated Roman generals, Alemannic warlords, and Visigothic kings. More importantly, he had woven together the spiritual and political strands of post-Roman Gaul. Catholicism gave him a unifying ideology. Roman administration, preserved through bishops and senatorial elites, gave him a framework. Frankish military strength gave him the means. And though his kingdom would fracture among his sons, the idea he birthed endured. The fusion of Catholicism and kingship, of Latin law and Germanic custom, of sacred oil and iron sword. This was the foundation upon which medieval France would be built. You stand now in the Cathedral of Reims. Sunlight pours through stained glass, casting crimson and sapphire across ancient stone. In the crypt lies the memory of Clovis, the first Catholic king of the Franks. The font in which he was baptized has long since vanished. But the idea remains. From Charlemagne to St. Louis, from the Capetians to Napoleon, kings of France would return to Reims, to be anointed with the oil of Clovis. His baptism became not just a moment of faith, but a cornerstone of legitimacy. And yet, Clovis himself remains an enigma. A warrior who became a Christian king. A brutal ruler who unified Gaul under the cross. A barbarian who carried forward the Roman world by transforming it. In his story, we see the rise not merely of a man, but of a new age. An age where faith and power would intertwine, where the church would crown kings, and kings would protect the church, where the ruins of empire would give way to a new civilization, not Roman, not Germanic, but something wholly new. The world once held together by Rome was now a mosaic, fractured, yet vivid. In the early years of the 6th century, Europe no longer answered to a single emperor seated in marble halls or robed in purple in some imperial palace. The collapse of centralized Roman authority in the West had left behind a patchwork of kingdoms, each one an heir to the empire's legacy, yet each profoundly different in language, law, and faith. The landscape was filled with tension, between memory and innovation, between old Roman forms and emerging Germanic identities. It was a world in flux, where the past still clung to life in fading Latin inscriptions, decaying villas, and stubborn senatorial families, while the future galloped forward beneath the hooves of Frankish, Gothic, and Burgundian warlords. To walk across this Europe was to step into a world both familiar and strange. In Gaul, the largest and most dynamic of the successor kingdoms was taking shape under Clovis and the Merovingians. The Franks, once federates on Rome's frontier, now stood as the dominant force in northern and central Gaul. Clovis' conversion to Catholic Christianity had united his Frankish warriors with the Roman Catholic elite, creating a new hybrid culture where Latin law codes coexisted with Frankish tribal custom. And Roman bishops gave legitimacy to kings who still wore their hair long in the old tribal style. Yet unity was still fragile. Upon Clovis's death in 511, his kingdom was divided among his sons. In keeping with Frankish custom, the Merovingians believed in the division of royal territory as personal property, an inheritance to be split like livestock or land. And so, Gaul was carved into regions centered on cities like Soissons, Paris, and Metz, each ruled by a son of Clovis, each prone to rivalries that would soon turn brother against brother. Even so, Frankish Gaul was vigorous, growing, and Christian. Latin remained the language of the church and administration. Roman roads, though crumbling, still guided commerce, and the church, ever patient, ever watchful, began to stitch together a new sense of order amidst the chaos. To the south, the Visigothic kingdom clung to the hills and cities of Hispania and southern Gaul. Centered on the city of Toulouse, and later on Toledo, the Visigoths had once been Rome's enemies, sackers of the Eternal City in 410. Now they styled themselves as protectors of order. But a profound divide split the land beneath their feet. The Visigoths, like the Ostrogoths of Italy, were Arians, followers of a Christian doctrine that denied the full divinity of Christ. Their Roman subjects, by contrast, were Catholics. This theological rift was not merely a matter of abstract belief. It was a political and social fault line. The Catholic bishops regarded their Arian overlords with suspicion. The Visigothic kings, in turn, often treated the Roman elite with mistrust, occasionally excluding them from high office and confiscating church property. The result was a kingdom uneasy in its own skin, prosperous in places, but internally divided. That division would become fatal in 507, when Clovis marched south and defeated King Alaric II at Vouillé. Much of southern Gaul, including Bordeaux and Toulouse, fell to the Franks. The Visigoths retreated into Spain. Their ambitions in Gaul shattered. Yet in Hispania, their rule persisted and eventually deepened, especially as later kings like Ricard embraced Catholicism in 589, seeking unity with their subjects. But in the early 6th century, that transformation was still distant. For now, the Visigothic realm remained a kingdom with a Roman shell, but a Gothic soul. East of the Franks, the Burgundians carved out their own domain in the Rhône valley. Their capital, Lyon, sat amid the vine-covered hills once ruled by Roman governors, and the Burgundian kings styled themselves with the trappings of imperial dignity. Their kingdom was smaller than that of the Franks or Visigoths, but strategically placed, controlling vital trade routes through the Alps, and rich in towns and dioceses. The Burgundians, too, were Arians at first, but more tolerant than the Visigoths. Intermarriage with the Roman elite was common, and their legal code, the Lex Gundobada, sought to reconcile Roman and Germanic law into a unified system. But the Burgundians, like so many of these new kingdoms, were caught between rising powers. The Franks pressed from the north, the Ostrogoths from Italy loomed to the southeast. By the 530s, Burgundy would fall to Frankish conquest, absorbed into the ever-expanding Merovingian realm. But for now, in the early 6th century, it remained a proud and independent kingdom, a bridge between Rome and Germania, between the Latin and the Germanic worlds. Italy, however, was the true jewel of the old Roman crown, and its fate lay in the hands of Theodoric the Great. The Ostrogoths, under Theodoric's rule, had established one of the most stable and sophisticated successor states in the West. Though he had been a barbarian warrior, Theodoric ruled from Ravenna like a Roman emperor. He preserved the Roman Senate, maintained the imperial bureaucracy, and styled himself not as a conqueror but as a restorer of order. He even wore the purple. His government was dual in nature. Gothic warriors formed the military aristocracy, while Romans administered civil affairs. Theodoric insisted on religious tolerance, allowing Catholics to worship freely. Even as he remained Arian in doctrine, his court patronized both Gothic epic and Latin literature. He employed Boethius, the last great Roman philosopher, and Cassiodorus, the statesman and scholar who compiled Gothic royal records in Latin prose. In many ways, Theodoric's Italy was the most Roman of the barbarian kingdoms. Yet it was a precarious harmony, reliant entirely on his authority and vision. Rome, in Theodoric's hands, was a symbol more than a city. The Forum was silent, the aqueducts decaying, but the idea of Rome, of justice, order, and majesty, still lived in his laws and letters. Across the sea, in the fertile lands of North Africa, the Vandal kingdom endured, established after the sack of Rome in 455 and the conquest of Carthage. The Vandal realm was wealthy and powerful, thanks to its control of Mediterranean trade routes and the grain harvests of Africa. But it was also deeply hostile to its Roman subjects. The Vandals were fierce Arians and persecuted the Catholic clergy with zeal. Bishops were exiled, churches confiscated, monasteries destroyed. The religious divide here was not just tension, it was oppression. Unlike Theodoric's tolerant rule, the Vandals governed as outsiders, and the memory of their sack of Rome lingered like a scar. Yet Carthage was still a vital urban center, and Roman traditions clung to life even here. The baths still steamed, the mosaics still gleamed under North African sunlight, but something brittle lay beneath the surface. When Justinian launched his reconquest in 533, the Vandal kingdom would shatter quickly, undone by internal dissent and public resentment. But for now, in the early 6th century, they remained masters of North Africa, a brief and troubled echo of empire. Beyond the Danube and Rhine, the Roman world gave way to the dark forests of Germania, the rugged mountains of the Balkans, and the steppes of the Avars and Huns. Here, no centralized kingdoms yet emerged, but something was stirring. The Lombards, a Germanic people still roaming the plains of Pannonia, would soon migrate into Italy. The Slavs, just beginning their westward movement, would eventually reshape the Balkans. The Avars, successors to the Huns in their brutal mobility, loomed as a future storm. These lands, still largely outside Rome's grasp even at its height, were now rising as the frontier of the next transformation. And in the east, in the glittering city of Constantinople, the Roman Empire still lived. Unlike the fragile kingdoms of the West, the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire retained a powerful centralized government, vast revenues, and a standing professional army. Its emperors, Zeno, Anastasius, and soon Justinian, ruled from the imperial palace beside the Bosporus, issuing laws in Greek, negotiating with barbarian kings, and dreaming of restoring lost western provinces. They viewed the successor kingdoms not as equals, but as temporary embarrassments, barbarians squatting in rightful Roman lands. In time, this belief would fuel wars of reconquest. But for now, Constantinople watched and waited, gathering strength. This, then, was the world of the early 6th century. A continent of kings and bishops, warriors and scribes, a patchwork of identities, yet all still haunted by the idea of Rome. Though the empire was gone in the west, no kingdom dared to entirely abandon its memory. Law codes still bore Latin inscriptions. Cities still preserved the names of emperors. The church still taught in Roman categories. Even the barbarians, who had once raged at the gates of empire, now sought to wear its crown. The landscape had changed, but the spirit of Rome had not entirely vanished. It had been scattered like seeds, some falling on stony ground, others taking root in unexpected soil. In Frankish Gaul, in Gothic Italy, in Visigothic Spain and Vandal Africa, new polities arose, not as total rejections of Rome, but as adaptations, as continuities, as experiments. Some would fall quickly, others would endure, but all were part of a larger story, a story of transformation. And at its center lay a question that no sword could answer. What did it mean to be Roman, now that Rome no longer ruled? The Western Empire had fallen, but in the East, Rome endured. The city of Constantinople rose like a crown at the edge of Europe, its walls gleaming above the Bosphorus, its churches and palaces testifying to an empire not yet surrendered to the tides of time. Here, the idea of Rome persisted, not as nostalgia, but as living force, codified in law, protected by army and fleet, sanctified by the church. To walk through Constantinople in the early 6th century was to step into a world at once familiar and transformed. Latin still echoed in the courts and barracks, but Greek increasingly became the tongue of the people, the clergy, and the scholar. Senators still debated imperial policy, but their power paled beside the emperors and bureaucrats who ruled from the great palace. The city was a marvel of planning and ambition, a Rome reborn in marble and gold. Its heart was the hippodrome. Here, amid the roar of chariots and the cries of the crowd, politics and passion collided. The blues and the greens, the racing factions, were more than mere sports clubs. They were expressions of class, creed, and even theological allegiance. They could lift a man to power, or drag him to ruin. No emperor ruled Constantinople without reckoning with the factions, and none would feel their fury more profoundly than the man who would soon ascend the throne, Justinian. He was not born to rule. Flavius Petrus Sabatius, known to us as Justinian, came from humble stock in the Latin-speaking region of Dardania, in the Balkan backlands of the empire. His uncle, Justinus, had risen through the ranks of the imperial guard, the excubators, and improbably claimed the purple in 518 upon the death of the emperor Anastasius. A soldier by training, Justinus lacked polish and education, but he had something even more valuable, a brilliant nephew. Justinian came to Constantinople as a young man, perhaps no more than 20, and was given a classical education in Latin law, theology, and rhetoric. He absorbed the language of governance, the pulse of the city, and the intricacies of palace intrigue. When his uncle became emperor, Justinian became virtually co-ruler, acting behind the scenes with authority far beyond his title. Those who met him described a man both charismatic and intense. He was deeply religious, tireless in his work, and driven by an unwavering vision, the restoration of Roman greatness, not merely in territory, but in spirit. But before he could become emperor, he would face two formidable trials: marriage and fire. His love was Theodora, a woman from the margins of society. The daughter of a bear trainer and once an actress, a profession seen by many as disreputable. But Theodora was no ordinary courtier. She was intelligent, politically astute, and deeply compassionate, with a fierce commitment to justice for the marginalized, especially women. Their marriage scandalized the old elite, but Justinian persisted, with his uncle's blessing, and a change in imperial law to allow a senator to marry a former actress. Justinian and Theodora wed. She would become more than empress. She would become his partner in rule, his equal, his conscience, and his most trusted advisor. Together, they would weather the storm that nearly ended Justinian's reign before it began. In January of 532, just 5 years after his accession, Constantinople erupted in flames. The Nika Revolt, sparked by tensions between the Blues and the Greens, began as a protest against heavy taxation and corruption. But it quickly spiraled into an all-out insurrection. Rioters torched buildings, including parts of the imperial palace and the great church of Hagia Sophia. Senators who resented Justinian's reforms saw their chance and backed a rival claimant to the throne. For 5 days, the city burned. Justinian, overwhelmed and uncertain, considered flight, but Theodora would not hear of it. Her speech, delivered in the palace, as the city trembled, became legendary. In times like these, when death is certain, flight is the act of a coward. If you wish to flee, Augustus, you may do so, but I shall remain. Purple is a noble shroud. Her words stirred something ancient in Justinian, a Roman resolve that would not bend. He summoned his generals, Belisarius and Mundus, and launched a brutal counterattack. Imperial troops stormed the hippodrome, where the rebels had gathered. In a matter of hours, the rebellion was crushed. Some 30,000 citizens lay dead in the dust and blood of the arena. The rebellion ended not with compromise, but with fire and sword. It was a turning point in Justinian's rule, and a declaration of his iron will. With the city pacified, Justinian turned to rebuilding, not just structures, but the soul of the empire. He commissioned the construction of the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, to replace the one destroyed during the revolt. Its design was revolutionary, its scale unprecedented. The dome, suspended seemingly by divine will, soared above the marble floor like the vault of heaven. Mosaics shimmered with gold, incense floated in shafts of light, and pilgrims wept upon entering, struck by its majesty. When the emperor walked its polished floor at its dedication, he is said to have whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." It was not mere pride, it was prophecy fulfilled. The new Solomon, the lawgiver, the builder, the restorer. Justinian had survived the crucible, and now he would reshape the empire. Yet it wasn't only buildings he aimed to reconstruct. Justinian believed that a great empire required great law. The Roman legal tradition, vast, layered, and often contradictory, had grown unwieldy over centuries. So he commissioned a team of legal scholars, led by Tribonian, to compile, organize, and codify centuries of edicts, statutes, and juristic opinions. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It consisted of 4 parts: the Codex Justinianus, the Digest, the Institutes, and the Novellae. This work would outlive not only Justinian's reign, but the empire itself. It would become the foundation of legal systems across Europe, echoing through the halls of universities and courts for over 1,000 years. In law, as in architecture, Justinian sought not mere survival, but grandeur. But his dreams reached further still. The empire he governed from Constantinople was strong, wealthy, organized, and stable. Its civil service functioned, its tax base endured, and its army remained disciplined. But the western provinces, Africa, Italy, Spain, were in the hands of Germanic kings. To Justinian, these lands were not lost. They were waiting to be reclaimed. It was not ambition alone that drove him, it was duty. He saw himself as the heir to the Caesars, and believed that true Christian kingship required the reunification of the empire. With Theodora's support, and the skill of his generals, especially Belisarius, he prepared for war. But these wars would come at a cost. Gold and blood would be spent in equal measure. The dream of a restored empire would demand terrible sacrifices. Still, from the heights of Constantinople, Justinian looked westward, and saw not chaos, but promise. Constantinople was ready. Its streets had been rebuilt, its people subdued, its churches illuminated. Theodora watched from her golden throne, her face serene but watchful. The imperial court moved to her rhythm, poised between the glories of the past and the uncertainties of the future. Justinian, robe trailing, stepped into the basilica where banners hung with the insignia of emperors past. The city held its breath. The West would call again. The armies would march. And Rome, not the city, but the idea, would rise once more. In the annals of Constantinople, few weeks would burn as hot, or echo as long, as those that witnessed the Nika revolt. It began, as so many great conflagrations do, with grievances that had long simmered just beneath the marble surface of imperial grandeur. Tax burdens had grown unbearable. Corruption, especially among Justinian's bureaucrats, was rampant. The imperial court was seen as remote, authoritarian, and increasingly beholden to ruthless efficiency over tradition or clemency. The ordinary people, the craftsmen, the traders, even the minor aristocracy, murmured discontent. Yet the spark did not fall from the hands of rebels or senators. It came, improbably, from the hippodrome, from chariot races and team loyalties. In the early 6th century, Constantinople's social fabric was interwoven with the fates of two great chariot racing factions, the Blues and the Greens. To outsiders, they may have seemed like simple sporting allegiances, but within Constantinople, they represented far more: class divisions, regional loyalties, and even theological positions. The Blues were associated with the aristocracy and often aligned with orthodox positions, while the Greens appealed more to merchants and the lower classes, sometimes aligning with Miaphysite or Monophysite causes. To wear blue or green was to declare not just a pastime, but a worldview. On the 10th of January, 532, violence erupted at the races. A group of rioters, some from each faction, clashed with imperial guards and were arrested. 2, one blue and one green, were sentenced to hang, but both escaped, and the crowd's outrage grew. On January 13, during another race, the crowd filled the hippodrome with one thunderous chant: Nika, Nika, conquer, conquer. It was not just a cheer. It was a challenge. For 5 terrifying days, the city descended into chaos. The fires began at the Forum and swept toward the center of imperial power. Justinian's new tax policies had made him unpopular. His replacement of long-established bureaucrats with his own loyalists had angered the aristocracy, and his marriage to Theodora, still resented by many of high birth, fed the fury. In the flames, the old church of Hagia Sophia, first built by Constantine himself, was reduced to cinders. Rioters torched the baths of Zeuxippus, the Senate House, and even sections of the imperial palace. More alarming still, many senators, long wary of Justinian's centralizing instincts, joined the revolt. They proposed a new emperor, Hypatius, a nephew of the late Emperor Anastasius. Reluctant but surrounded by mob and senate alike, Hypatius was declared emperor in the hippodrome. It seemed Justinian's reign was all but over. Within the great palace, panic reigned. Justinian considered fleeing. He had already sent ships to prepare for departure. His advisors debated escape routes. The empire, it seemed, would fall not to barbarian swords, but to its own people. Then, Theodora spoke. Her words, preserved by the historian Procopius, would become legendary. My lords, the present occasion is too serious to allow me to follow the convention that a woman should not speak in a man's council. If you, Emperor, wish to save yourself, there is no difficulty. We have ample money. The sea is open. The ships are ready. But consider first whether, when you reach safety, you will not regret that you did not choose to die here. For myself, I hold to the ancient saying that the purple is a noble shroud. A silence followed. The empress's courage galvanized her husband. Justinian would not run. He summoned his most trusted generals, Belisarius, young and bold, and Mundus, veteran and ruthless. He ordered a bold plan. The gates of the hippodrome would be sealed, locking the rebels and Hypatius inside. Then, at Justinian's command, imperial troops stormed the hippodrome. The carnage was terrible. Over 30,000 people, citizens, partisans, and rioters, were slaughtered. Hypatius, despite his reluctance, was executed. The senators who had supported him were stripped of wealth and exiled. By the end of January, the revolt was crushed, but the city lay in ashes. Where some rulers might have tightened control or sought vengeance, Justinian saw an opportunity to rebuild, not merely restore. In place of the old Hagia Sophia, he envisioned something unprecedented, not merely a church, but a monument to divine authority. A structure so vast, so brilliant, so audacious, that it would declare to the world the glory of both God and emperor. He summoned the best minds of the empire, not architects in the traditional sense, but mathematicians, Anthimus of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus. Their task? To defy the boundaries of Roman architecture, to raise a dome like no other, to create a church unlike anything since Solomon's temple. Construction began almost immediately. In 532, for 5 years, tens of thousands of laborers toiled, with marble brought from across the Mediterranean, green from Thessaly, purple porphyry from Egypt, gold mosaic glass from Syria, and alabaster from Anatolia. The dome would span over 100 feet, supported not by traditional columns but by pendentives, architectural innovations that allowed a circular dome to rise above a square base. When completed, it seemed to hover, weightless, floating above shafts of light and walls of gold and glass. Inside, every surface shimmered, candles flickered in hanging lamps, casting moving shadows upon the mosaic saints. The nave opened like the sky itself. Worshippers gasped. Foreign dignitaries stood silent in awe. When Justinian entered the completed church in 537, tradition holds he whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." But Hagia Sophia was more than a church. It was a symbol, a reminder that Constantinople was not a backwater remnant of empire, but its very heart, that here, civilization endured, that God had not abandoned Rome, but had sanctified it anew. It would stand for over 1,000 years as the largest cathedral in Christendom, only surpassed after the fall of Constantinople. Even then, under the Ottomans, it would continue as a mosque, and later as a museum and mosque again, a monument not just to a faith, but to human ambition and vision. Justinian, emboldened by survival and reconstruction, pressed forward. The lessons of the Nika revolt had taught him that force, vision, and symbolism must work in tandem. No emperor could rule by sword alone, or by prayer alone. He must embody both, and Justinian would. In the years following the revolt, He embarked on the codification of Roman law, as seen in Chapter 7. Reforms to administration, renewed focus on religious unity, and, most famously, military campaigns in Africa and Italy to restore the territorial integrity of the empire. Yet none of it would have been possible without that moment of decision. When a woman in purple reminded the emperor that empires are not built on safety, but on resolve. From the charred ruins of Constantinople rose a renewed empire. From the ashes of Nika rose Hagia Sophia, eternal, shining, sacred. And from the uncertainty of rebellion rose a new Justinian, iron-willed, divinely guided, determined to shape not only his century, but all centuries to come. In the wake of fire and bloodshed, while ash still clung to the porticos of Constantinople and the scent of rebellion lingered in the stones of the hippodrome, Emperor Justinian began an even more audacious project than the building of Hagia Sophia. It would not tower in the skyline nor shimmer with gold, but it would shape the foundations of civilization for over 1,000 years. This was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, a legal resurrection of the Roman world. Not with spears and legions, but with parchment and principle, Justinian sought to reunite the fragmented empire through the unifying force of law. The Roman legal system, by Justinian's time, was vast, ancient, and, frankly, unwieldy. It stretched back nearly a millennium, to the 12 tables of the early Republic, to Cicero's courts, to the reforms of Augustus, and the edicts of emperors long turned to dust. Each generation of rulers had added, amended, overridden. There were imperial decrees, juristic commentaries, senatorial decisions, local regulations, provincial variations. Many laws contradicted each other. Some were forgotten, others duplicated in obscure texts. Legal scholars joked that understanding the law required more years than a priest needed to know theology, and far more patience. But Justinian was not patient. Nor was he content with confusion in a realm he sought to make one. And so, in 528 CE, he summoned Tribonian, a brilliant, albeit controversial, legal mind known for both his encyclopedic knowledge and his willingness to maneuver through the tangled corridors of court politics. Justinian tasked him with something no one had dared since the time of Augustus. Bring order to the laws of Rome. Collect, compile, purify, make them one. The project would unfold in 3 monumental stages, each of them a revolution in legal history. First came the Codex Justinianus, a compilation of imperial constitutions, or laws enacted by emperors. It replaced earlier codices, especially the Theodosian Code, and weeded out contradictory or outdated legislation. The goal? A coherent, official record of enforceable imperial law. Published in 529, it became the spine of legal authority in the empire. But Justinian was only beginning. The second phase would be far more ambitious and creative. It involved the Digesta, or Pandex, a compendium of the greatest legal thought of the Roman world. For centuries, Rome had produced jurists of unmatched brilliance, Ulpian, Paulus, Gaius, Papinian, and others, who wrote legal treatises, commentaries, and responses to hypothetical legal cases. Tribonian's team, comprising 17 top scholars, read through over 2,000 books and 3 million lines of legal text, extracting the most valuable insights and adapting them into a coherent whole. Their task wasn't just archival, it was architectural. They had to prune, clarify, and restructure the sprawling mass of Roman legal philosophy into something usable and enduring. By 533, the Digest was published, a monumental 50-book collection of legal wisdom. In this alone, Justinian achieved something the empire had never done before. He codified the legal soul of Rome. Simultaneously, the team produced the Institutes, a teaching manual for students of law, which distilled Roman legal principles into an accessible and structured format. Think of it as a textbook. It explained property, contracts, obligations, persons, crimes, the DNA of civil society. This too was published in 533, timed to coincide with the digest, forming a comprehensive legal education package. And finally, the Novellae Constitutionis, the new laws. These were new legal edicts issued by Justinian himself in the later years of his reign, which addressed evolving issues not covered in the earlier works: church-state relations, property disputes, legal rights of women, and more. When combined, these four parts, codex, digest, institutes, and novels, formed the Corpus Juris Civilis. It was more than a legal compilation. It was an imperial ideology, a vision of society structured by justice, where law did not merely punish but shape civilization. You sit in the corner of a great hall in Constantinople, parchment in hand, watching Tribonian debate with other jurists. They argue fiercely, but respectfully, about a case involving land inheritance. One quotes Ulpian, another counters with a precedent from Hadrian's time. A scribe notes every word. The emperor himself, Justinian, steps forward, his presence calm but commanding. Clarity is divine, he says. Let the law reflect the heavens, ordered, just, and radiant. To those in the room, this was not merely administration. It was cosmic order, the will of God expressed in civic terms. Justinian believed law was a sacred duty. Where Rome had once ruled through the sword, now it would rule through precedent. Where the West had fallen into chaos, now there would be frameworks for justice. Carried to the edges of empire, into Italy, North Africa, and the eastern provinces. Even centuries later, long after Justinian's empire was gone, the laws he codified lived on. When Charlemagne built his empire, his scholars looked to Justinian. When medieval universities arose in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, they taught the digest and institutes. When Napoleon built the Code Napoleon, he borrowed liberally from the Corpus Juris Civilis. Even modern legal systems, from Germany to Latin America, and even elements of U.S. law, echo Justinian's vision. Yet the corpus also tells us something profound about the era. It wasn't just that Justinian organized the past. It was that he believed the past still mattered, that Roman identity, even if fractured politically, could survive in law. That continuity was possible not by reclaiming every city, but by preserving the legal and moral foundations of what it meant to be Roman. Even as Belisarius was campaigning in Africa and Italy, even as the treasury strained and barbarians massed at borders, Justinian pressed forward with this civilizational mission. For him, the law was Rome's soul, and this soul could live on, even as emperors came and went. It's worth noting, too, that the Corpus Juris Civilis addressed new social realities. Women, for example, gained clearer property and inheritance rights. Slavery, while not abolished, was bounded by tighter restrictions. Guardianship laws protected minors and orphans. Marriage laws were refined. Provisions were made for public welfare. Contracts, criminal penalties, civic duties. In its vastness, it was a mirror of society, and a tool to shape its future. You speak with a student, newly enrolled in the legal academy near the Forum of Constantine. Why study this, you ask? He replies, eyes gleaming, because this teaches us what is just, and how justice survives even when emperors do not. You walk away knowing, Justinian had not merely reigned, he had written himself into history. Not with battles alone, but with the ink of enduring law. Centuries later, As the Western world stumbled through feudalism and fragmentation, a spark from Constantinople's golden age would glow in monastic libraries, in parchment manuscripts, in whispered judgments passed down in courts. And when the world emerged from its darkness, it would reach again for the light of Justinian's law, and find it still shining. The sails unfurl against the crisp Mediterranean breeze, and with them rises an imperial ambition long buried beneath the rubble of Rome's past, Justinian's dream of reconquest. Unlike the grandeur of ancient legions, this force is small, modest, silent, but its commander, Belisarius, is a name that will thunder through history. In 533 AD, while the ink still dries on the Corpus Juris Civilis, and Constantinople's skyline gleams anew with Hagia Sophia's domes, Emperor Justinian prepares for war, not in theory, but in steel. His target? The Vandal kingdom of North Africa, once a jewel in Rome's crown, now ruled by an Arian dynasty whose name had become synonymous with the empire's humiliation. It was the Vandals, after all, who had sacked Rome in 455. Carrying off the treasures of the Eternal City, including, most painfully, the sacred vessels looted from the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, taken to Rome in 70 AD by Titus. These relics were more than gold. They were symbols of imperial legitimacy and divine favor. To recover them was not just to reclaim wealth. It was to reclaim the past. The situation, as fortune would have it, was favorable. The Vandal king Gelimer had dispatched a large part of his army, including his brother, to suppress a rebellion in Sardinia. It was a fatal distraction. Justinian, always the master of seizing opportunity cloaked in chaos, ordered Belisarius to sail. "You are there," aboard one of the nearly 500 ships crossing the sea, carrying around 15,000 soldiers and sailors. A small number, especially compared to the massive and disastrous expedition of 468, where Rome lost nearly all its fleet to storms and poor leadership. This time, Justinian wagers on skill, not size. And what skill he chooses. Belisarius, though barely in his 30s, has already proven himself in the east against the Persians. Tall, broad-shouldered, and reserved, he inspires confidence not through speeches, but through calm, calculated mastery. Soldiers under his command don't mutter about fate, they trust in his genius. Unlike many generals of old, Belisarius is not cruel nor prone to excess. He keeps strict discipline, forbids looting, and presents his mission not as conquest, but as liberation, a word that resonates with the Roman population still living under Vandal rule. The fleet lands near Carthage with minimal resistance. It's a ghost of its former self, the same city that once dared challenge Rome under Hannibal. Now a capital of an unstable, aging kingdom, Belisarius marches quickly, avoids direct confrontation, and allows no provocations. His spies report that Gelimer, upon learning of the landing, is panicking. He had underestimated both the timing and scale of the attack. Then comes the clash. Two main battles define the campaign. The Battle of Ad Decimum, just 10 miles from Carthage, where Gelimer attempts a three-pronged ambush. But the attack falters due to poor coordination, and Belisarius seizes the moment, pressing the assault and routing the Vandal forces. Gelimer flees. Later, the Battle of Trichemarum cements the outcome. The Vandals, weakened and demoralized, face Belisarius in open combat. His cavalry breaks their line, their ranks disintegrate. By March 534, it is done. The Vandal kingdom collapses, barely resisting more than a few months. Gelimer is captured and brought back to Constantinople in chains, though he will later be treated with a degree of honor and offered land. But the real triumph is what Belisarius brings back. The sacred treasures of the Jewish temple, symbols of three conquests, Jerusalem, Rome, and now Carthage. Vast wealth, including African grain, taxes, and slaves, and most of all, hope that Justinian's plan to restore the Western Roman Empire may not be madness after all. The streets of Constantinople erupt in celebration. Belisarius, in a rare honor, is granted a Roman triumph, parading through the city with spoils, prisoners, and symbols of victory. Yet he walks with humility, eyes lowered, as if aware that this victory is just the beginning of something greater and darker. You sit beside a scholar in the imperial library, and he whispers, "The Vandals ruled here for a century. Now they are a footnote." But they were more than that. The Vandals, often maligned by history, had built a functioning kingdom. Though Arian Christians, they permitted some Catholic worship. Their navy had once controlled the western Mediterranean. Their capital in Carthage rivaled any in the west. But internal divisions, religious tension, and external threats slowly unraveled their cohesion. Gelimer's fatal flaw wasn't tyranny, it was complacency. Justinian's propaganda spins the campaign as the beginning of the Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the empire. And it's not entirely a lie. For the first time in generations, Africa returns to Roman control. And with it comes stability. At least for a time. The fertile farmlands that once fed Rome again supply Constantinople. Trade revives. Roman administration replaces the Vandal elite. Yet not all celebrate. Some local populations, weary of shifting rulers, wonder whether a distant emperor offers more justice than a local king. Others fear the Byzantine tax collectors, notoriously efficient, and soldiers, with little land promised to them, grow restless. Still, Africa is a victory, swift, decisive, and bloodless compared to what is to come. For Belisarius, this campaign solidifies his mythos. In just a few months, he has accomplished what legions failed to do with 10 times the men. But his reward is complex. Justinian, both proud and paranoid, watches his general closely. After all, Roman history is filled with victorious commanders who became threats to the throne. Belisarius, loyal but now wildly popular, must tread carefully. In private, he refuses titles, avoids politicking, and even hands over the treasures of Carthage without claim. His loyalty, almost excessive, becomes a paradox, admired, yet feared. Meanwhile, the success of Africa emboldens Justinian to turn his gaze westward again, toward Italy. The Gothic kingdom, once under Theodoric, is now weakened by internal strife. If Africa could fall in a year, could Rome itself be reclaimed? The answer, as history will show, is yes, but at terrible cost. Unlike Africa, Italy will not yield easily. It will fight, it will bleed, and Justinian's victory there will leave a trail of ruined cities, shattered aqueducts, and depopulated fields. But that is another chapter. Tonight, in the flickering candlelight of the imperial palace, Justinian speaks with Theodora. He speaks of destiny, of divine favor, of the Vandal gold glittering in the treasury. You overhear his final words before turning in. Africa is Roman again. Let the world remember. And remember it does, for a moment. But as the emperor dreams of reconquest, storms gather on other horizons, in Italy, in Persia, and beyond. Still, for now, the empire celebrates, a victory long denied, a revenge long awaited, and a general, Belisarius, steps into legend. The ink on the African treaties had barely dried when Justinian turned his eyes toward an older, grander dream, the return of Italy, and with it, the eternal city itself, to imperial hands. The conquest of the Vandal kingdom had proven that the western provinces were not beyond reach. It was not only possible to restore the empire, it was inevitable. Or so it seemed. But what came next was not a triumph. It was a tragedy. The campaign in Italy, unlike the swift stroke in Africa, would become a long, grinding war of attrition. It would consume resources, devastate cities, and turn the once glorious Italian peninsula into a shell of its former self. The pretext for invasion emerged, as so often in imperial politics, from a dynastic crisis. The Gothic king Theodoric the Great had died in 526 AD, leaving a power vacuum. His grandson Athalaric, a child at the time, was placed under the regency of his mother Amalasuntha, a Roman-educated and pro-Byzantine queen. But her enlightened rule stirred resentment among the Gothic nobility. When Athalaric died young in 534, Amalasuntha ruled alone briefly, until she was imprisoned and then murdered by her cousin Theodahad. Who seized the throne? Justinian, ever ready to seize moral high ground, used her death as casus belli. He claimed to be avenging an ally and restoring order. But in truth, he saw an opportunity, a fractured kingdom, weakened leadership, and a promise to the Roman people in Italy that they had not been forgotten. In 535 AD, Belisarius, still young, now legendary, was once again chosen to lead the imperial army. The expedition began modestly. A small fleet landed first in Sicily, which was secured without serious resistance. The campaign appeared to echo the African War: quick, efficient, clean. Naples fell after a brief siege. Rome, that ancient prize, opened its gates to Belisarius in December 536. The citizens cheering the return of imperial authority. Statues were re-erected, banners unfurled, coins minted with Justinian's face. For a moment, it seemed as if the Western Empire was being reborn. But the moment did not last. The Goths regrouped under a new leader, Vitiges, a soldier of talent and determination. He laid siege to Rome in 537 AD, surrounding the city with tens of thousands of Gothic warriors. Belisarius, outnumbered and cut off, was now defender rather than conqueror. The siege dragged for over a year. Famine stalked the streets. Aqueducts were cut. Disease spread. Ancient monuments were pulled apart for stone to reinforce the walls. But Belisarius held firm, launching sorties, encouraging the people, refusing surrender. His leadership, once praised in victory, was now tested in desperation. Eventually, imperial reinforcements forced the Goths to withdraw. But this was only the beginning of a war that would stretch for nearly 2 decades. The Gothic War became a nightmare without end. City after city changed hands multiple times. Florence, Milan, Ravenna, and dozens of lesser towns were besieged, bombarded, starved into submission. Fields were trampled by armies. Farmers fled. Trade ceased. Roads decayed. Famine followed. You, an imperial scribe accompanying Belisarius, witnessed the transformation firsthand. What was once the beating heart of Roman civilization becomes a land of corpses and ghosts. The Roman Senate, once the symbol of republican dignity, is nearly wiped out in Milan, where a Gothic counterattack results in the massacre of its Roman defenders and civilian supporters. Belisarius continues to win victories, but each comes at greater cost. His pleas for reinforcements are met with delays. His authority is undercut by jealous bureaucrats in Constantinople. Worse, Justinian begins to suspect his general's ambition. In 540, as Belisarius takes Ravenna, the Gothic capital, he is recalled, though hailed as a hero by the troops. He is denied the title of consul or patrician. He returns home in triumph, only to be rewarded with suspicion. But the war is not over. The Gothic leader Totila emerges, one of the most remarkable men of his age. charismatic, tactically brilliant, and determined to restore Gothic rule. Totila wins the loyalty of his people and reconquers much of Italy from imperial hands. Rome, once more, is lost, then retaken, then lost again. In 546, Totila enters Rome and finds it nearly abandoned. The city, which had once held over 1 million people, is now home to a few thousand. He attempts to resettle it, to restore Gothic order, but Justinian sends another army. This time, the emperor dispatches a different general, Narses, a eunuch and courtier, but an exceptional organizer and strategist. In 552 AD, Narses meets Totila in battle at Tagenae. Totila is killed. The Gothic resistance crumbles. By 553, the last Gothic forces are defeated. The war is over. Italy is Roman again. But at what cost? What you see in the aftermath is not a rebirth, but a ruin. The population has been halved or worse. Rome is a hollow shell. Its aqueducts broken, its temples looted. Agriculture has collapsed. Cities lie abandoned. Entire regions are lawless, ruled by brigands or deserters. The imperial treasury, flush after the African victory, is now empty. The armies are exhausted, and Italy, the jewel of the West, has become a burden rather than a prize. Even Justinian, once full of fire and vision, now grows old and cautious. The war had spiritual consequences too. The churches of Italy, many damaged or looted, become the centers of authority. Bishops, not governors, oversee reconstruction. The papacy, though nominally subject to Constantinople, begins to chart its own course. Monks retreat to the hills, founding monasteries amid the ruins. It is they, not emperors, who will preserve the legacy of Latin learning in the centuries to come. And yet, the victory is not entirely hollow. For a time, Italy is again part of a unified Mediterranean empire. Stretching from Spain to Syria, Roman law is reimposed. Byzantine governors sit in marble halls once ruled by Caesars. But the shadows gather again. In 568 AD, only a decade later, the Lombards will sweep down from the north. Invading a broken peninsula, they will carve out new kingdoms amid the ruins. And the long dream of restoring the West will fade once more into myth. You stand on the Palatine Hill, gazing over Rome's ruined skyline. Columns toppled, statues defaced, churches rising beside pagan ruins. The empire has returned, but in name only. The cost has been too great. An officer beside you murmurs, "We changed the master, but not the fate." By the mid-550s, the dream that had driven Justinian for decades, the restoration of Roman unity, was nearing its furthest possible reach. Africa was under imperial rule. Italy, though shattered by war, was once more a part of the empire. The islands of the Mediterranean, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearics, had been reclaimed. Only one great piece of the Western Roman world remained just out of reach: Hispania. The ancient province of Spain. Unlike Africa or Italy, Spain was not in chaos. Since the early 5th century, it had been ruled by the Visigoths, a powerful Germanic kingdom that had taken root following the Western Empire's collapse. Their capital at Toledo had become a center of wealth, learning, and power. But by the mid-6th century, the Visigothic kingdom was riven by internal division, dynastic feuds, religious conflict between Arians and Catholics, and rival claimants to the throne. To Justinian, this looked like another opportunity. In 552 AD, even as the final battles of the Gothic War were being fought in Italy, Justinian dispatched a small fleet and army across the Mediterranean. The general Liberius, an elderly but capable commander, was tasked with exploiting a civil war within the Visigothic realm. A noble named Athanagild had risen in rebellion against the ruling king Agila, and sought outside help. Justinian, always eager to insert the empire into barbarian politics, agreed to support Athanagild, though with his own agenda. Byzantine forces landed in southern Hispania, quickly capturing coastal cities such as Cartagena, Malaga, and Corduba, though they came under the pretext of alliance. It soon became clear that Justinian intended to keep these territories. Athanagild, once victorious, demanded the departure of the Byzantine troops. But the empire refused, as had happened in Italy. The banner of the empire now flew not as a favor, but as a permanent restoration. By 554 AD, the emperor issued the Pragmatic Sanction, officially incorporating the reclaimed territories into the Roman Empire. A new province, called Spania, was established. It was small, a narrow band along the southern and southeastern coasts, but strategically vital. It gave the empire a foothold in the Iberian Peninsula and secured maritime routes across the western Mediterranean. From this point onward, for nearly 70 years, the Byzantines would rule in Spain. Governors were appointed from Constantinople. Roman law was reinstated. Churches were built or reclaimed. Latin remained the language of governance. It was, by all appearances, a final jewel in the imperial diadem. But this last expansion marks a turning point. The reconquests had succeeded geographically, but not sustainably. Even as banners were raised in Spain, Justinian's empire was beginning to strain under its own weight. Italy lay in ruins, the treasury was emptied, and plagues, especially the Justinianic plague of 541 to 542, had depopulated cities from Alexandria to Antioch. The army was thinly spread across 3 continents, constantly engaged in wars of reconquest, resistance, and rebellion. At court, Justinian's once golden reputation was beginning to tarnish. He had ruled for over 30 years. Once praised for his energy, vision, and wisdom, he now seemed increasingly detached. He withdrew from public appearances, delegating more authority to eunuchs and palace officials. Religious disputes, particularly over Monophysitism, the theological position held by many in Egypt and Syria, took up more of his attention than affairs of state. The death of Empress Theodora in 548 AD struck a deep blow. She had been his confidant, his equal, the steel beneath his majesty. Without her, Justinian became more isolated. You, now an older court historian who once accompanied Belisarius in Italy, find yourself writing dispatches from Constantinople in the final years of Justinian's reign. The empire seems strangely quiet, like the eye of a storm, but tensions simmer everywhere. In Italy, imperial control is contested by local warlords and Gothic holdouts. The fields are empty. Roman roads lie in disrepair. In Africa, Moorish tribes harass border towns. Governors write home begging for troops that never arrive. In Spain, Visigothic kings wait patiently, biding their time for the empire to blink. In the east, the real storm gathers. Persia, under Khosrau Ia, bold and expansionist Shah, constantly probes the eastern borders, seeking to avenge prior defeats. Even as banners of Rome fly over new provinces, the emperor himself is growing old, brittle, and consumed by theology. Justinian's court becomes a strange place, haunted by the ghosts of past triumphs, and yet nervous of the future. Whispers abound. Who will succeed him? He has no surviving children. His nephew Justin, a mediocre administrator, is the likely heir, but many fear that Justinian's death will trigger chaos. At night, you hear the clink of armor in the corridors. Paranoia stalks the palace. One evening, in the shimmering candlelight of the great palace, a general leans to you and says, half in jest. We've reclaimed the empire, but can we keep it? Or have we only stirred up ghosts that will now haunt us? In 565 AD, the inevitable arrives. Emperor Justinian the Great, Basileus of the Romans, dies in his bed, aged over 80. He had reigned for 38 years, one of the longest and most consequential reigns in Roman history. No great funeral procession winds through the streets. No games are held. The city is quiet, tired. His body is laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles. Beside emperors of old, beneath the mosaics he commissioned, in the city he had reshaped. His reign had been one of monumental ambition and tremendous cost. What did Justinian leave behind? Territory. The empire was at its largest in centuries, stretching from the Tigris to the Tagus. But many of these lands were fragile, depopulated, and rebellious. Law. His corpus juris civilis would outlast all else, a foundation for medieval law and modern jurisprudence. Faith. His reign deepened the empire's commitment to Christian orthodoxy, but also widened the rift between East and West. Chalcedonians and Monophysites. Architecture. The Hagia Sophia, standing still and vast in Constantinople, would echo his name for over 1,000 years. But the dream, the restoration of Rome, was already unraveling. Within a few years, the Lombards invaded Italy, establishing new barbarian kingdoms. Spain was retaken by the Visigoths, driving out the Byzantines. Egypt and Syria fell into religious strife that weakened loyalty to Constantinople. And less than a century after Justinian's death, Arab armies would sweep across the Middle East and North Africa, undoing nearly all of his reconquests. And yet, something endured, even as the empire shrank again. The memory of Justinian's restoration would live on, as inspiration, as lesson, as warning. The mosaics of Ravenna still glisten with his image. His laws continue to shape Europe. His church, the Hagia Sophia, stands to this day, silent testimony to a man who believed the old world could be restored. You, now retired in a coastal monastery, write the final lines of your history. You do not call it a failure. You do not call it a victory. You call it what it was, a last, brilliant flame before the long twilight. As the dust of empire settled and the political map of the Mediterranean fractured into countless pieces, one institution remained, flexible yet firm, fragmented yet united, Roman yet transformed, the Christian Church. Where legions disbanded, where governors fled, and where emperors were reduced to memory, bishops remained. The end of imperial cohesion in the West left behind a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped the Church. Not with swords and tribute, but with continuity, literacy, and authority. By the mid-6th century, as Justinian's conquests faltered and barbarian kingdoms calcified into permanence, the Church emerged as the most enduring legacy of Rome. You travel now not with armies, but on dusty roads between monasteries, cathedrals, and bishoprics, tracing the arteries of the post-Roman world. And everywhere you go, from the highlands of Gaul to the ruins of Roman Britain, you find the cross planted where the eagle once flew. From civitas to see, the bishop becomes the governor. In the classical world, the city, civitas, was the engine of Roman civilization. Laws were administered there, taxes collected, justice dispensed, and commerce thrived under the protection of urban walls and magistrates. But as barbarian invasions grew more frequent and the imperial military retreated, these civic systems collapsed. What rose to replace them was something new, the bishopric. In towns like Rome, Milan, Arles, and Trier, bishops began to take on roles that had once belonged to curial officials. They negotiated with invading armies, arbitrated disputes, organized defenses, distributed alms, and even repaired aqueducts and roads when no one else would. The church had an advantage the empire had lost: moral legitimacy and grassroots loyalty. You speak with a Gaulish landowner near Clermont, who tells you plainly, "The count is a brute who collects tribute." But the bishop baptized my children, fed my tenants, and buried my father. I know whom I trust. The transition was gradual, but real. By the late 6th century, bishops were not just spiritual shepherds, but also secular administrators. Their dioceses often mapped onto old Roman jurisdictions, and their titles, like metropolitan, archbishop, or pontiff, reflected Roman hierarchy. Rome had baptized its own infrastructure. A new kind of power, the papacy, rises. No bishopric was more important, symbolically or politically, than Rome. Though the Western Empire had collapsed, the Bishop of Rome, or Pope, claimed an authority that transcended fading frontiers. Rooted in the apostolic succession of Saint Peter, the Roman pontiff now stood as the heir not just of apostles, but of emperors. This rise was not immediate. In the chaotic 5th century, popes often struggled to assert influence beyond their immediate vicinity. But by the time of Pope Leo I, reigned 440 to 461, the papacy had begun to speak with a new voice, universal, moral, Roman, and Christian. You imagine Leo standing before Attila the Hun in 452, imploring the warlord to spare the city. Whether it was diplomacy or divine intervention, Attila turned away, and the pope's stature grew. A century later, Pope Gregory I, Gregory the Great, would write sermons, launch missions to pagan England, manage granaries, and send letters to Frankish queens and Gothic kings. He was, effectively, the most influential man in the West. Gregory once said, "Non angli," said angeli, not angles, but angels, when he saw pale-haired English boys in the Roman slave market. He sent Augustine of Canterbury to evangelize Britain. From that moment on, Rome would not just receive pilgrims, it would send missionaries to the ends of the known world. 3. Monasteries. Islands of light in a darkening world. Outside the bishoprics, another institution grew in influence, power, and sanctity: the monastery. If bishops replaced governors, monks replaced scribes, scholars, and stewards, they were keepers of memory. In the shadow of empire's fall, it was in the cool cloisters of stone monasteries that classical texts were copied, laws preserved, agriculture maintained, and souls saved. You visit Monte Cassino, the monastery founded by Benedict of Nursia around 529. It stands upon the ruins of a pagan temple. Here, Benedict wrote his Rule, a concise guide to monastic life that would define Western monasticism for centuries. Ora et labora, pray and work. His rule offered a balance of contemplation, manual labor, communal life, and scholarship. It created stability, humility, and endurance in a time when most institutions collapsed. From Ireland to Italy, Gaul to Germany, Benedictine monasteries would become centers of literacy, repositories of ancient texts, and beacons of social order. You speak with a monk in Larens, on a coastal island off Gaul, as he tends to grapevines and recites Virgil's Aeneid. All knowledge, he says, is sacred, if it brings us closer to truth. IV. Christian kings and Roman memory. The Church did not merely survive the fall of empire, it became the bridge between empires. Many barbarian kings sought legitimacy by aligning themselves with Roman Christianity. The Franks, under Clovis, converted to Catholicism instead of Arianism, winning the support of the Roman population and the clergy. The Visigoths in Spain, the Lombards in Italy, and even the Anglo-Saxon kings in Britain eventually followed suit. The Church provided them with ritual, literacy, moral authority, and a connection to Romanitas, the intangible prestige of Rome. You attend the coronation of a Frankish king, where Roman law is quoted. A bishop presides, and Latin hymns echo through a wooden chapel. The symbols are new, the meaning is ancient. In this way, Rome lived on, not through emperors and eagles, but through liturgies, litany, and Latin, versus Eastern continuities and divergences. In the East, where the Byzantine Empire endured, the relationship between church and state took a different path. The emperor in Constantinople remained the supreme ruler, basileus, but was also a kind of priest-king, divinely appointed to guide both polity and piety. The Eastern Church was more centralized, more hierarchical, and more tightly woven into the fabric of state. Yet even here, monasticism thrived, especially in remote places like Mount Sinai, Mount Athos, and the Syrian desert, where hermits pursued mystical union with God in silence, fasting, and solitude. The theological differences between East and West, about the nature of Christ, the authority of the Pope, and liturgical practices, would in time sow the seeds of schism. But in the 6th century, the Church still saw itself as one universal body, even as its limbs stretched in different directions. Memory, scripture, and civilization. You realize, in your final reflections, that the Church was not merely an institution. It was the vessel of memory. The monks who copied Virgil also preserved the Psalms. The bishops who debated heresies also kept Roman legal customs. The missionaries who preached to kings also taught them to write. This fusion, Roman, Germanic, Christian, was the foundation of medieval Europe. Had the Church not preserved Latin, law, and literature, the West may have slid into an abyss of forgetting. Instead, it entered a period of quiet resilience. Conclusion. The lamp in the long night. As you leave a monastery in southern Gaul, watching candlelight flicker in the scriptorium, you realize that this quiet place holds more power than armies. Here, amid ink and vellum, prayer and silence, the future is being shaped, not by conquest, but by preservation. The empire fell, the Church remained, the eagles fled, the cross stood firm. In time, new empires would rise, Frankish, Byzantine, Carolingian, Holy Roman, but each would carry the imprint of the Church that stood as a bridge from antiquity to Christendom. Rome's sword may have rusted, but its spirit lived on, in chalice and manuscript, in chant and cathedral. Evening settles over the landscape of memory. Our long journey through the echoes of empire draws to a close. And as the lamps are lit and the wind rustles through the ruins of a once mighty world, one question lingers like incense in a church. What does Rome still teach us? We have walked among emperors and exiles, monks and monarchs, bishops and barbarians. We've watched the slow crumbling of marble palaces, the quiet copying of forgotten texts, the forging of new realms from the dying breath of the old. And now, as we sit beneath a star-strewn sky, in a garden of reflection, perhaps in Ravenna, or perhaps only in imagination, we turn inward. Because to study Rome is not simply to study the past. It is to study ourselves. Lesson 1. Nothing lasts forever, and that's okay. Rome, the eternal city, proved not so eternal after all. Its Western Empire fell, not in a day, but over decades, even centuries. Its collapse was not a single moment of catastrophe, but a prolonged transformation, a shift from central authority to local power, from marble to monastery, from emperor to bishop. And yet, Rome's fall teaches us not despair, but perspective. Even the grandest systems, the longest-lasting institutions, And the most powerful empires are ultimately finite. Their decline may be resisted, delayed, managed, but not wholly avoided. Change is not the enemy of civilization, it is its inevitable companion. So what do we do in the face of that change? We adapt, as Theodoric did, as the bishops and scribes and farmers did, as the monasteries did when they turned ruins into scriptoria and silence into learning. From Rome, we learn that resilience lies not in permanence, but in reinvention. Lesson 2. Culture outlasts power. Odoacer dethroned the last emperor in 476. But in 2025, over a millennium and a half later, you are hearing this story. You are speaking words shaped by Latin. You are thinking within a framework of law, identity, and governance deeply rooted in Roman ideals. Rome's armies are long gone. Its borders erased, but its cultural DNA remains imprinted on the Western world. From Roman law came the principles that underpin modern civil codes. From Roman architecture, the arches and domes that still grace our capitals. From Roman literature, models of storytelling and rhetoric. And from Roman ideals, like citizenship, civic duty, public service, came the aspirations of republics and democracies yet unborn when the Senate fell silent. So Rome reminds us that influence need not be loud to be lasting. Culture, quietly preserved, re-emerges. Ideas, like seeds scattered in the wind, can bloom centuries later. The sword rusts, but the word endures. Lesson 3. Identities are fluid, not fixed. Who were the Romans? The citizens of the Republic? The emperors of the Principate? The Christians of the 4th century? The senators of Ravenna? The Romoi of Byzantium? The Franks who crowned Charlemagne, emperor of the Romans? Rome teaches us that identity is not carved in stone. It changes. It evolves. It absorbs. In the aftermath of the empire's fall, people redefined what it meant to be Roman. Some clung to the name, others shed it and adapted. The Visigoths and Ostrogoths adopted Roman legal forms. The Church absorbed Roman administration. The Germanic kings ruled in Roman palaces. Even the enemies of Rome became its heirs in ways they never expected. This, perhaps, is one of history's most hopeful lessons. Identity is not a wall, it's a bridge. A process, not a possession. Rome did not die. It transformed, into Byzantium, into Christendom, into the idea of civilization itself. And so, in a world still struggling with questions of belonging and difference, Rome shows us how integration, not isolation, fuels endurance. Lesson 4. Institutions matter. Rome's fall was hastened not just by barbarian invasions or economic pressures, but by the gradual breakdown of institutions. When emperors ruled by whim, when the military was undermined by political intrigue, when civic service became burdensome instead of noble, then Rome's ability to respond to crisis weakened. Its roads still ran straight. Its aqueducts still flowed, but its institutional spirit had dimmed. And yet, where institutions were maintained, in the church, in the legal codes, in local governance, continuity survived. Rome teaches us that institutions are the memory of a civilization. They store its values. They channel its energy. They offer structure when individuals fail. They are imperfect, slow, and vulnerable to corruption, but without them, even the greatest powers crumble into dust. In a modern world that often distrusts or underestimates institutions, the Roman experience offers a vital warning and a quiet affirmation. They matter more than we know. Lesson 5. The past is always present. Finally, Rome teaches us something subtle but profound. The past never truly disappears. It lingers, in words, in ruins, in customs, in the very shape of our cities and the frameworks of our thought. We may not always recognize it, but we are never free of it. This is not a burden. It is a gift. To be human is to inherit language, stories, structures, dreams, and to shape them in turn, passing them forward. Rome's legacy endures not because it was perfect, but because it was adaptable, resonant, and imperfectly human. In the garden again. Let us return one last time to our garden in Ravenna. The air is still. The lanterns flicker. Somewhere, a monk is writing by candlelight. A child sleeps under a Roman arch converted into a chapel. The city is quiet, smaller than it once was, but not dead. It is still becoming. And so are we. As you close your eyes tonight, let your thoughts wander through Rome's corridors, not just the marble halls of power, but the hidden spaces, a dusty manuscript, a forgotten road, a whispered prayer. These are Rome's true legacy. The empire fell, but Rome became an idea that still whispers through time. As we close this long and gentle journey through the rise and fall of empires, through the fading echoes of legions and the soft prayers of monks, may the quiet lessons of Rome linger in your dreams. History, like sleep, brings us closer to understanding, not only of the past, but of ourselves. If tonight's story has brought you a moment of peace, a spark of thought, or helped you drift into restful sleep, then this journey has found its purpose. Let the stillness of the night carry you softly, like a Roman galley on calm waters, into the realm of dreams, where the past speaks in whispers and time loses its edge. Before you go, if you believe that history can be beautiful, that stories can be soothing, and that learning can bring rest, please take a moment to crescent moon like this video, to let us know it brought you comfort. Speech balloon comment below and share your thoughts. Every word helps build this calm, curious community. Link share this video with someone who needs gentle sleep and a little wonder. Scroll and subscribe to Dreams of Time, where history comes alive not with noise, but with stillness, wonder, and rest. Each night is a new chapter. Each dream, a page yet turned. Until next time, sleep deeply, dream wisely, and remember, the flame of Rome never truly died. It passed to all of us. Good night, and thank you. As the thunder of legions faded and the grandeur of marble forums crumbled into dust, the real test of Rome's legacy began, not in palaces or palimpsests, but in villages, farmsteads, and kitchen hearths. While emperors fell and kingdoms rose, ordinary people, the farmers, artisans, priests, mothers, scribes, and children, continued to live, love, work, pray, and die. And in the quiet persistence of their lives, a remarkable truth becomes clear. Rome never truly disappeared. It mutated, adapted, and lingered, woven into the everyday rhythms of a changing world. You walk now not through war rooms or council halls, but along country roads, through marketplaces, and past monasteries tucked in wooded glens, trying to understand what became of Rome in the lives of its people after the imperial eagle fell. The fabric of daily life, worn but not torn. Step into a modest villa in southern Gaul in the mid-6th century. The mosaic floors are cracked. The hypocaust no longer warms the baths, and the silverware has been replaced with hand-thrown pottery. But the family still speaks a form of Latin, still names their children Flavius, Julia, or Severina. In the courtyard stands a cross where once a laurel bush bloomed. A monk visits weekly to read scripture. A traveler might mistake this place for a ruin, but it is very much alive, simply reduced, resilient, and repurposed. Though the infrastructure of the Western Roman Empire deteriorated, roads broken, aqueducts dry, amphitheaters silenced, the mental world of Rome persisted. Latin was still the language of law, liturgy, and literacy. Roman customs still governed marriage contracts. land disputes, and inheritance laws. The rhythms of daily life, sunrise prayers, market days, seasonal festivals, were still shaped by Roman tradition. Now baptized by Christian faith. You see a farmer bless his plow in the name of Christ but till his field using Roman techniques. His village is ruled by a local lord, perhaps of Gothic or Frankish descent, but taxes are still calculated using Roman terms like solidus and modius. In the bones of daily life, Rome endures. Language. Vulgar Latin and the seeds of Europe. Language is perhaps the most powerful proof of continuity. From Britain to Iberia, Italy to Gaul, the fall of empire did not sever the tongue of Rome. Instead, Latin evolved. What scholars would later call vulgar Latin, the spoken, everyday dialect of the people, became the mother of new languages: Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Romanian. These weren't breaks, but branches from the same tree. A child in 6th century Aquitaine might learn the Lord's Prayer in Latin at church, speak a rustic dialect at home, and name the months by Roman reckoning. Literacy declined, yes, but it never vanished. Monks copied texts. Bishops issued decrees. Kings affixed their seals to documents written in imperfect but recognizable Latin. Rome lived in the syllables of peasants and princes alike. 3. Law and custom. The inheritance of the leges. In the wake of Rome's collapse, barbarian kingdoms emerged with their own warrior codes and tribal traditions. But even the fiercest rulers, Ostrogoths, Franks, Visigoths, quickly recognized the value of Roman law. Rather than erasing it, they codified it. The Breviary of Alaric, 506, in Visigothic Spain, the Lex Romana Burgundionum, and Theodoric the Great's adaptation of Roman legal principles in Italy all testify to this. These were not merely foreign kings imposing brute rule. They saw themselves as custodians of Roman justice. You imagine a Gothic judge settling a property dispute between two Roman landowners. The proceedings may be in Gothic accented Latin, with parchment stretched thin and ink smudged. But the case follows principles laid down centuries before in the Institutes of Gaius or the Digest of Justinian. The legal continuity is breathtaking. In a world where almost everything else changes, borders, armies, dynasties, the legal culture of Rome outlasts its power. The changing cityscape. Rome in ruins and renewal. Cities, the jewels of the Roman world, faced the harshest transitions. Rome itself, once the teeming heart of an empire, became a ghost of glory. Its population plummeted from over 1 million to perhaps 30,000. Its monumental buildings, temples, baths, theaters, were scavenged for stone. Grass grew in the forum. And yet, people still lived there. The Pantheon, once a temple to all gods, was consecrated as a church. The Colosseum became a quarry and then a shelter for the poor. The Aqua Virgo aqueduct still carried water. Pilgrims still flocked to the tombs of martyrs. Other cities followed similar patterns. In Milan, Arles, and Ravenna, civic life diminished, but episcopal power took its place. Bishops built new churches where basilicas once stood. Markets moved to cathedral squares. The old curia gave way to the clerical synod. Urban life did not vanish. It transformed. Versus agriculture and the land. Continuity beneath the soil. If the empire was a machine, the land was its fuel. And even after the collapse of central administration, the land, and those who tilled it, remained. Roman villi rustici, large agricultural estates, often continued to function. The coloni, semi-free tenant farmers, remained in place. Over time, these structures would evolve into the manors of feudal Europe. But their roots lay in Roman rural economics. Agricultural techniques persisted, crop rotation, irrigation, wine and olive production. In Gaul, Spain, and northern Italy, Roman plows still cut furrows into familiar soil, and amphorae still carried wine and oil to regional markets. The rural economy, stable and conservative, served as a foundation for survival. When trade declined and cities shrank, the countryside absorbed the shock. The empire may have fallen, but the earth remained fruitful. Education and memory. Preserving the mind of Rome. One of the most vital arteries of cultural continuity ran through monasteries and cathedral schools. Where education persisted, though fewer and far between, centers of learning did not vanish. They changed hands. The senatorial tutor gave way to the monastic scribe. The imperial library was replaced by a monastery's scriptorium, and the curriculum, though narrowed, still included grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the pillars of Roman education. You watch a young monk in Luxoi labor over a manuscript, copying Cicero's De Officiis. His Latin is unpolished, the parchment is reused, but the words, centuries old, are still legible. Elsewhere, bishops collect texts for their private libraries. In Ireland, isolated from invasions, monks copy not only scripture but Ovid, Pliny, Boethius, the dying embers of Roman thought carried across generations. This transmission will form the intellectual core of the Carolingian Renaissance centuries later. The seed of Rome survives in ink and candlelight. Ritual, time, and sacred order. Even the calendar, the very structure of time, was Roman in origin and Christian in adaptation. The 7-day week, the names of the months, and festivals like Calends, Ides, and Saturnalia were absorbed and rebranded. Christmas aligned with Sol Invictus. Saints' days replaced local cults. The passage of time remained sacred, now measured not by consuls, but by feasts, fasts, and liturgical cycles. Church bells replaced town criers. The Mass replaced the civic oration. But in both cases, Rome's obsession with ritual and order continued. Death and the afterlife, burial and memory. One of the most intimate ways Roman culture persisted was in how people treated the dead. Roman funerary customs, inscriptions, sarcophagi, memory tablets, continued, but the language of mourning shifted. Inscriptions once praising civic virtues or pagan piety now invoked Christ, martyrdom, and eternal life. You kneel by a 6th century grave in a Gallic churchyard. The epitaph reads in rough Latin, "Here lies Marcus, servant of God, who fed the poor and prayed for the city. May he rest in peace until the resurrection." Death had always been a window into the soul of a civilization. Even here, we see not erasure but transformation. Conclusion. Rome reassembled, not replaced. In the grand theaters of history, the collapse of Rome appears cataclysmic, a thunderous fall from glory. But in the everyday lives of its former subjects, it was less a fall than a slow rearrangement. New powers rose, new languages formed, new boundaries were drawn. But beneath it all, the habits of Rome persisted, in speech, in law, in farming, in worship, in dreams. Civilization, like water, finds new channels. Rome did not end. It flowed into the molds of new cultures: Visigothic Spain, Frankish Gaul, Christian Britain, Lombard Italy. And in those places, Rome would wait, in broken pillars, in whispered prayers, in manuscripts bound in leather, until one day, it would rise again, reshaped but recognizable, in the form of medieval Christendom. The sun is low on the horizon. The air is warm, heavy with the scent of laurel and rosemary. You are sitting in a quiet garden in Ravenna, the once glittering capital of the Western Roman Empire. Birds flit between cypresses, and somewhere nearby, a bell tolls softly from a monastic chapel. The world is peaceful, but your thoughts are not. Before you lie fragments of memory, the glint of an imperial diadem, the shadows of ruined walls, the fading echo of Latin rhetoric in Senate halls. You've walked through the ruins and remnants of a fallen empire. You've spoken with emperors, generals, farmers, monks, and now, in this still place where East and West once met, a question presses upon your heart. Why did Rome fall? The Garden of Ravenna, with its cracked mosaics and blooming vines, becomes your sanctuary of reflection. The mirage of decline. Historians once described Rome's collapse as a decline, a slow moral and cultural decay. The noble values of the Republic gave way to decadence. Bread and circuses replaced virtue. Christianity sapped the empire's strength. Lead poisoned the water. Citizens became cowards. Soldiers grew soft. The barbarians overran what was left. But as you consider the evidence, the cities that continued, the laws that endured, the faith that flourished, this theory feels insufficient. Rome did not simply rot from within. Instead, what you've seen is a world in transition, where some things decay, others evolve, and still others, remarkably, persist. The empire's own shadow. The seeds of Rome's unraveling were sown by its own success. This empire, so mighty and vast, created a world so interconnected that any tremor in one corner rippled across the whole. By the 4th century, Rome had reshaped its neighbors. The Goths, Franks, Vandals, Huns, once distant and disorganized, had grown stronger through contact with Rome. They adopted Roman weapons, Roman tactics, Roman ambitions. Rome made us what we are, a Gothic elder once told you. And so, we broke Rome, not out of hatred, but inheritance. The very borders that had once protected the empire became porous. Refugees, raiders, and settlers all pushed inward, not to destroy Rome, but to live within it. But Rome no longer had the strength to absorb them. 3. Internal fractures. In Ravenna, where emperors once ruled, the walls tell a quieter story, one of division, not invasion. The empire had become politically unstable, racked by usurpations, rival generals, and puppet emperors. Civil wars drained resources. Ambitious men turned against the state. At crucial moments, capable leaders were murdered. Stilicho, Aetius, Majorian. You recall one senator's bitter words: "We killed our own saviors." We feared their power more than the barbarians. Even the army, once the backbone of Roman might, had grown unreliable. Recruitment lagged. Discipline faltered. More and more, the legions were filled with federates, barbarian allies under their own leaders, whose loyalty was uncertain. At the worst possible moment, Rome turned on itself. The economic slow bleed. In the garden, you finger a copper coin, worn, barely legible. Once, it might have bought a loaf of bread or a cup of wine. Now, it's almost worthless. The empire's economic system, so dependent on control of fertile provinces like Egypt and North Africa, faltered when those regions were lost. Grain shipments ceased. Tax revenues dried up. Gold grew scarce. Inflation surged. Trade routes collapsed. Urban economies shrank. The government could no longer pay soldiers, build infrastructure, or manage public services. What remained of central authority became more extractive, more desperate. The empire taxed us into starvation, a Gallic farmer told you once, and then asked why the Vandals seemed kinder. The spiritual shift. Some blame Christianity for the empire's fall, arguing that it sapped the martial vigor of Rome. But in Ravenna's churches, in mosaics of Christ and saints, you see something different. The empire did not die because of faith. It died, in part, because of divided faith. After Constantine, Christianity surged, but unity did not follow. Instead, Theological disputes, Arianism, Donatism, Monophysitism, sparked deep schisms. These divisions became political flashpoints. In Egypt and Syria, imperial attempts to enforce doctrinal orthodoxy provoked rebellion. Bishops and emperors vied for supremacy. Councils replaced senates. The church became a power unto itself, often at odds with the state. And yet, paradoxically, Christianity also preserved Rome. While emperors fell, bishops remained. Churches became town centers. Monasteries preserved classical texts. The gospel became a new Roman language, one that could be spoken even when Latin faded. V. Geography's judgment. From your seat in Ravenna, you look east, toward Constantinople, the new Rome. There, the empire lived on for nearly 8,000 years after the West's collapse. Why did the East survive? The answer lies partly in geography. The Eastern Empire had richer provinces, stronger defenses, a more defensible capital. It faced different enemies, had fewer usurpations, and preserved more effective institutions. Its emperors could tax Egypt, control Anatolia, and use the Bosporus as both trade artery and moat. The West, by contrast, was fragmented, vulnerable to the Alps, the Atlantic, and the long open roads of the Rhine. V. Did Rome truly fall? As the garden darkens, you return to the question, did Rome fall? The answer may depend on what Rome means. If it was an empire of legions and laws, then yes, it fell. Piece by piece, over a century, no final battle, no dramatic collapse, but a gradual fading, like the setting sun over Ravenna's domes. But if Rome was a civilization, a set of values, a vision of order and justice, then no, it did not fall. It migrated, it transformed, it endured in the church, in monasteries, in cathedrals, and in the minds of men. When Charlemagne crowned himself emperor in 800, he called himself Roman. When Justinian built Hagia Sophia, he saw himself as the true heir of Augustus. When Renaissance scholars copied Cicero, they did so in Roman script, on Roman parchment, under Roman vaults. 8. Rome as a mirror. In this garden, once Gothic, once Roman, now Christian, you come to see Rome not as a nation, but as a mirror. Each generation sees what it needs in the story of Rome: grandeur, decline, redemption, corruption, rebirth. Its fall is not a warning alone. It is a meditation on how civilizations change. They are not eternal, but neither are they fragile. They are mosaics, each tile representing people, customs, hopes, fears. Some fall away, others remain, and in time, new hands rearrange them into different patterns. Ix. The last light. The sky above Ravenna turns deep blue, then black. Stars flicker into view, silent. Ancient observers of this ever-changing earth. Somewhere in the distance, a child recites Latin prayers. A farmer tends a Roman field. A scribe copies a Roman law. A bishop speaks in a senate once silenced. You rise from your bench. The garden is quiet. The empire is gone. And yet, Rome endures. In stone, in word, in soul. The Roman Empire, even in its twilight, never stood alone. It was always part of a broader world, a world filled with other peoples, other ambitions, and other rising forces. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire was not simply the result of internal decay or bureaucratic failure. It was also shaped, sharply, profoundly, by external pressures and the adaptations of those once seen only as enemies beyond the frontiers. This chapter steps out from Rome's crumbling cities and looks outward, into the forests of Germania, across the Danube and Rhine, and beyond the vast steppes from which thunder once rolled. We trace the movements of peoples, the evolution of new political identities, and the strange alchemy through which barbarians, became kings. The barbarians beyond the borders. The Roman imagination was long haunted by the barbarian. To the patrician senator or the city dweller in Gaul, barbarians were uncultured, brutish, dangerous at best, curious novelties at worst, existential threats. But the truth was far more complex. By the 4th century, the peoples living beyond the Roman lines were not primitive or disorganized. The Goths, Franks, Vandals, Burgundians, and others had undergone tremendous internal transformation. They had adopted elements of Roman military structure, architecture, religion, and even governance. Some Gothic chieftains wore Roman armor. Frankish warriors spoke Latin alongside their native tongues. Many of these groups had served Rome for generations as foederati, allied peoples with semi-autonomous status within the empire. You remember sitting by a fire in a Gothic encampment, speaking to a nobleman named Wulfgar. "We trade with Rome, we fight for Rome, we marry Roman women," he had said. "What more must we do to be Romans ourselves?" Pressures from the east. The Huns arrive. It was not only Roman decisions that shaped this era. A fierce pressure from farther east changed everything. The arrival of the Huns. Around 370 AD, this horse-borne confederation exploded into Eastern Europe. Their swift raids, terrifying discipline, and brutal tactics drove waves of refugees across the Danube. Chief among these were the Goths, who begged Emperor Valens for asylum in 376. Rome agreed, but poorly managed the process. Starved, mistreated, and extorted, the Goths rose in revolt. In 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, they dealt the empire one of its worst defeats in centuries. Emperor Valens himself was killed. From this point on, the balance was broken. Rome could no longer dictate terms. It had to negotiate, often on the back foot. The Huns, meanwhile, continued their storm. Under Attila, they attacked both Eastern and Western empires. They demanded gold, tribute, land, though ultimately stopped at Chalon in 451. Their destabilizing effect was irreversible. You once saw the aftermath of a Hunnic raid, villages burned, grain fields charred, livestock scattered. "We fled to Rome," a survivor whispered, "but Rome could not feed us. Rome could not protect us." What is Rome, then? 3. The evolution of the Goths and Vandals. In the wreckage of these migrations, new powers emerged. The Visigoths, once refugees, became a kingdom. Under Alaric, they sacked Rome in 410. A symbolic wound that echoed across the empire. Yet they did not seek destruction. They wanted legitimacy, land, and a place in Rome's world. By the mid-5th century, they had settled in Gaul and Hispania, establishing a realm that mixed Roman administration with Gothic leadership. They adopted Latin, built cities, and maintained Roman law, for Goths and Romans alike. The Vandals, another migrating group, crossed the frozen Rhine in 406, pushed through Gaul and Spain, and finally seized North Africa in 439. Under Gaiseric, they took Carthage and built a powerful navy. Rome lost its breadbasket. A few years later, in 455, they sacked Rome itself. Yet in Carthage, they didn't merely destroy, they governed. They created courts, minted coins, and negotiated with the Eastern Empire. Though Arian in faith and harsh toward Catholics, they still functioned as Roman rulers in a strange new form. These barbarians were no longer on the outside looking in. They were inside, reshaping the empire from within. The Franks, a new type of power. While the Goths and Vandals moved through imperial frontiers, the Franks grew in strength from their homeland along the Rhine. Originally a loose confederation of tribes, the Franks had long served as Roman foederati in northern Gaul. But under Clovis, r. 481 to 511, they achieved a political revolution. Clovis converted to Catholic Christianity, not Arianism, like most other barbarian rulers. This move aligned him with the Roman population, with the Church, and with the Pope. His rule was seen not as alien domination, but as a continuation of Roman Christian civilization. You remember a Roman bishop in Soissons telling you, "The face is Germanic, the crown is Frankish, but the soul, yes, the soul, is Roman." Clovis's descendants, the Merovingians, ruled a hybrid kingdom. Frankish warriors upheld old tribal codes, but Roman elites staffed the bureaucracy. Latin remained the language of law. Roman customs shaped taxation and land ownership. It was a new kind of Rome, a Frankish Rome, versus barbarian adaptation, not invasion, but integration. It's easy to think of the fall of Rome as a military catastrophe, a series of violent invasions. But the reality was more subtle, more layered. Yes, cities were sacked, battles were lost, but across the West, barbarian kings didn't want to erase Rome. They wanted to wear its crown. In Ravenna, Theodoric the Ostrogoth ruled as a Roman-style king. In Spain, Visigothic nobles issued laws in Latin. In Gaul, Frankish kings built basilicas. Even in Britain, where Roman rule vanished more completely, new leaders adopted Roman symbols to legitimize themselves. This is what makes the so-called fall of Rome so difficult to pinpoint. Because Rome did not end. It became something else. The cost of transformation. Yet this transformation was not bloodless. You've seen towns burned, aqueducts shattered, and libraries pillaged. You've heard the silence of ruined forums. You've walked through farmlands abandoned by their tenants, their roads choked by weeds. For ordinary people, the change often meant hardship, higher taxes, less security, new rulers speaking strange tongues. Cities shrank, trade declined, literacy waned outside the church. There was loss, undeniably, but there was also creation. In the rubble, new orders took shape, some more just, some more brutal, but all bearing the strange inheritance of Rome. Rome as a prize. The idea of Rome itself, its memory, its symbols, remained so powerful that every new ruler wanted to claim it. Theodoric ruled in Ravenna, not just as king of the Goths, but as consul and patrician. Clovis received gifts from the Eastern emperor, dressing his court in Roman fashion. Even Attila demanded recognition from Constantinople as a co-equal of the Roman emperor. Rome was more than territory. It was an idea, a gold crown passed from hand to hand. Even as the hands change. 8. The irony of influence. And in one of history's greatest ironies, Rome taught its enemies how to end it. By granting citizenship, training federate armies, encouraging trade, and spreading its culture, Rome had created a world where barbarians no longer looked alien. They looked familiar, almost Roman. It was Rome's strength that made it vulnerable. Its universality became its weakness. And when its enemies came, they did not come to destroy. They came to inherit. Reflections in the garden. You return again, in memory, to that quiet garden in Ravenna. There, among olive trees and broken statues, it becomes clear. The barbarians didn't destroy Rome. They entered it, they changed it, just as Rome had changed them. The fall was not a cliff, but a long slope, a descent into something new. And perhaps that is what history always is, not endings, but transformations. They came from the east like a storm, their approach heralded not by scouts or envoys but by rumor and terror. Few had seen them and lived to describe them in detail. But their name, the Huns, echoed like a thunderclap across the Roman world in the 4th and 5th centuries. What these fearsome horsemen began was not merely a series of raids or invasions. Their appearance sparked a domino effect, disrupting the balance of power, displacing entire peoples, and hastening the collapse of Rome's Western army. Without the Huns, the Western Empire may well have endured in some diminished form. With them, the system cracked, fatally. This chapter takes us into the steppes and battlefields, tracing how one people shattered centuries of Roman stability and changed the course of history. The origins of the Huns. The Huns did not spring fully formed from the earth. Their roots lie deep in the Central Asian steppes, possibly linked to the Xiongnu who had once challenged China's Han dynasty. Moving westward over generations, the Huns arrived on the fringes of Europe around 370 AD. Just as the Roman world was struggling to maintain its borders, they were alien in every way: appearance, speech, tactics. Unlike the Germanic tribes Rome had long dealt with, the Huns operated by different rules. Mounted warriors since childhood, they lived in the saddle, wielded composite bows with deadly skill, and struck with speed and unpredictability. Their goal was not to settle, but to extract wealth and power. Their strength lay not in static conquest, but in mobile devastation. One Roman chronicler, Ammianus Marcellinus, described them as not so much men as moving mountains of terror. But such fear masked a deeper truth: the Huns were highly organized, with a shrewd political instinct. Shattering the frontier. The Gothic refugees. The first great consequence of the Hunnic advance came not from their direct attack on Rome, but from the chaos they caused among others. In 376, a wave of Gothic refugees appeared at the Danube frontier, begging to be let into Roman territory. The reason? The Huns had swept into their lands, burning villages, enslaving populations, and crushing resistance. The Goths, desperate and disoriented, fled. The Romans, confident in their superiority, agreed to let them in, on paper. In practice, the Goths were exploited, starved, and mistreated. What began as a humanitarian crisis became a military disaster. In 378, near the city of Adrianople, the Gothic refugees rose in revolt. Emperor Valens, ignoring advice to wait for reinforcements, attacked. His army was annihilated. Valens himself perished, his body never found. Adrianople shocked the Roman world. It was not just a military defeat, it was a revelation. The empire could no longer manage the movements of peoples it had once controlled. Worse still, the old military formula no longer worked. 3. The rise of Attila. If the early Huns were feared, their reputation became mythic under one man, Attila, who came to power in the 430s and ruled until his death in 453. Attila was more than a warrior, he was a diplomat, psychologist, and kingmaker. He understood the psychological warfare his image created. He cultivated an aura of invincibility and cultivated alliances, bribes, and betrayals with cunning precision. Under his leadership, the Huns became not just a threat but a superpower. In the east, they extorted gold and tribute from Constantinople, forcing humiliating treaties on the Eastern emperors. In the west, they interfered in dynastic struggles, demanded marriage alliances, and raided deep into Gaul and Italy. In 451, Attila's advance culminated in the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, also known as the Battle of Chalon. Roman general Flavius Aetius, allied with the Visigothic king Theodoric I, managed to halt the Hunnic advance. The battle was brutal, inconclusive, and yet it marked the high tide of Hunnic power in the west. The next year, Attila invaded Italy, devastating cities like Aquileia and approaching Rome itself. Yet mysteriously, he turned back, perhaps due to famine, disease, or political pressure. Legend says Pope Leo I persuaded him to withdraw. Whatever the reason, Attila died suddenly in 453. Without his leadership, the Hunnic Empire collapsed with astonishing speed. But the damage had already been done. IV. The military collapse of the West. The Roman military system, once the envy of the world, was by this point fragile. Decentralized and underfunded, its legions were hollowed out by civil wars, declining recruitment, and over-reliance on barbarian mercenaries. Whole sections of the army were no longer Roman in culture, training, or loyalty. Many officers were themselves of Germanic origin, owing their allegiance more to generals than to emperors. In the 5th century, Rome no longer had the strength to garrison its frontiers, let alone reclaim lost provinces. The sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410, and later by the Vandals in 455, underscored this weakness. The Western Empire grew dependent on men like Ricimer, a Germanic general who effectively controlled the Western government from behind the throne. Even the empire's finest general, Flavius Aetius, who had defeated Attila at Chalon, was murdered by Emperor Valentinian III in 454, perhaps out of jealousy or fear. Within a year, Valentinian himself was assassinated. This constant cannibalism of leadership crippled any chance of revival. The army collapsed not with a bang, but in a slow disintegration, as loyalty frayed and borders evaporated. The end comes slowly. By the 470s, the Western Empire was reduced to a shadow, a few provinces in Italy. Nominal authority over lands already controlled by Germanic kings, and a crumbling administrative structure. The final blow came in 476, when the barbarian general Odoacer deposed the teenage emperor Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer didn't proclaim himself emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and ruled Italy as king. Under nominal recognition from the Eastern Roman Emperor, the Western Roman Empire had ended, not with fire and ash, but with a transfer of symbols. The legacy of the Huns. The Huns disappeared almost as quickly as they had arrived. Their empire fractured after Attila's death. Their former subjects, the Ostrogoths, Gepids, Heruli, fought among themselves and drifted into history. But their impact was permanent. They set entire peoples in motion, causing the so-called migration period or Völkerwanderung. They broke the Roman military system, exposing its weakness and encouraging its enemies. They reshaped the map of Europe, indirectly giving rise to the successor kingdoms that would define the medieval West. A Roman official once told you, "We built walls for centuries." The Huns made us realize the walls were already crumbling. The Huns reminded Rome that no power is eternal, no army unbeatable, no empire unshakable. In the wake of the storm, as you sit years later in a quiet garden in Ravenna, reflecting on these events, the chaos of the past seems like distant thunder. The Huns are gone, but their echo remains. The Goths now rule Italy. The Franks hold Gaul. The Visigoths shape Spain. Each of these powers owes something to the Huns, whether in their formation, migration, or consolidation. And yet Rome survives, not as an empire, but as an idea that even the Huns could not destroy. Let the lamps be lit now in Constantinople. Let their golden flickers catch the glint of domes and porticos, of colonnades still standing firm while the world elsewhere crumbles. As the western provinces of the Roman Empire fragmented into a mosaic of successor kingdoms, some fleeting, others enduring, there remained one exception, luminous and unlikely: the Eastern Roman Empire. Byzantium. It did not fall. It did not shatter. It transformed. It endured. And in that endurance lies a profound tale of resilience, adaptation, and an inheritance carried forward through centuries. It is tempting to see Byzantium merely as a survival, an echo of a former greatness. But that would be a disservice to the vigor and complexity of this empire that outlived its western half by nearly 1,000 years. It would be an injustice to the city of Constantine, built upon the bones of ancient Byzantium, to call it merely a continuation. No, Byzantium was an evolution, a distillation, a furnace where Roman law, Hellenic culture, Christian spirituality, and Eastern sensibility were refined together, forming something wholly new and strangely familiar. As we peer out from the balcony of the Great Palace, the Marmara Sea shimmers like liquid bronze under the moonlight. The silhouette of the Hagia Sophia looms, still young in this 6th century, its vast dome defying gravity, hovering over the city like the eye of heaven. This is not Rome, and yet, it is. Let us journey back to understand why this city survived when Rome did not. The answer lies in a confluence of factors: strategic geography, economic wealth, effective administration, cultural unity, and, perhaps most importantly, an ability to adapt to changing times without losing the core of its identity. Constantinople was blessed by geography. Positioned at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, it commanded key trade routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Between the Aegean and the inland empires of the East, the Bosphorus Strait was not just a natural barrier, it was a spine of civilization. Both bridge and moat, protecting and empowering the city. The city's formidable walls, most famously the Theodosian walls, rendered it nearly impregnable. Triple layers of stone, towers, and moats had withstood sieges that would have flattened lesser capitals. Huns, Avars, Arabs, all would come, battering their fury against the city's defenses. And all would fail, at least for centuries. The western cities, Rome among them, could not boast such defenses. Their bones were laid bare to the storms. Then came the gold. Unlike the resource-starved West, the East retained the wealthier provinces: Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant. These lands fed Constantinople both grain and silver, sustaining its legions and its ambitions. Even during crises, the imperial coffers in the East never reached the level of destitution seen in the West. And money, always and everywhere, buys time. It pays soldiers. It builds ships. It maintains diplomacy. But perhaps more significant than wealth or walls was Byzantium's administrative legacy. The Eastern Empire had inherited, and refined, the elaborate bureaucratic machine of Diocletian and Constantine. Civil service, taxation, provincial governance, all remained largely intact. In the West, provincial governors became warlords or pawns. In the East, they remained officials of the emperor. Where the West decayed into fragmentation, the East leaned into centralization. And looming above it all, presiding like a star at zenith, was the emperor himself. In Justinian's time, the emperor was not merely a ruler. He was God's chosen on earth, the living image of divine order. Draped in silks, flanked by icons and gold, he processed through the palace corridors as both monarch and priest, his authority sanctioned by heaven and law. This divine kingship offered something the West lacked: legitimacy not rooted in lineage or brute force, but in providential destiny. Justinian, as we have seen, embraced this role with an almost apocalyptic sense of mission. He rebuilt Constantinople after the Nika revolt. He codified the laws. He reconquered North Africa, Italy, parts of Spain, but just as importantly, he fostered a vision of Byzantium as the true Rome, a Christian Rome, an eternal Rome. And even as those Western gains would wither after his death, the idea endured. In culture, too, Byzantium offered something unique. Unlike the Latin-speaking West, Where literacy faltered and libraries were shuttered, the East preserved and evolved the traditions of classical Greece. Greek, not Latin, became the language of philosophy, theology, administration, Homer's epics, Plato's dialogues, Aristotle's logic. They were copied, debated, preserved not only in monasteries but in public schools and university-like institutions. Byzantine scholars were guardians of knowledge, transmitting it forward through centuries. Even as war and plague battered the empire's body, religion was the soul of Byzantium. But unlike in the West, where the Church increasingly operated independently from imperial control, the Eastern Church remained tightly intertwined with the state. Emperors convened councils, enforced orthodoxy, exiled heretics. This unity, though sometimes brutally imposed, offered a cultural coherence that bolstered imperial identity. A heresy in Byzantium was not just an error of faith, it was an act of treason. And yet, Byzantium was not stagnant. It changed, it responded. When faced with the loss of Syria and Egypt to the rising forces of Islam in the 7th century, it pivoted. New military districts, the Damata, replaced the old provincial system. These were not just administrative units, they were lifeboats. Soldiers farmed the land they defended. Armies became local, self-sufficient, tied to the soil. The state, once a great leviathan fed by taxes and grain, became leaner, more flexible. It did not die, it adapted. This capacity to reinvent without severing the past, this was Byzantium's genius. Its art, too, tells the story. Early Byzantine mosaics echo Roman realism but shimmer with otherworldly golds and elongated saints. Architecture borrows Roman engineering but transforms it with domes and light and sacred geometry. The body of Rome remained, but the soul had been anointed. And the city itself, Constantinople, became a microcosm of this duality. Within its walls, a citizen might hear Homer recited and the gospel chanted. A procession for the Virgin might pass under arches built for Constantine. Coins bore the image of Christ, yet called their ruler, Basileus of the Romans. Byzantium was not just surviving Rome. It was Rome reimagined through a Christian lens, infused with Eastern mysticism and pragmatic resilience. Its influence reached far beyond its borders. Slavic peoples were converted by Byzantine missionaries. Cyril and Methodius created alphabets and liturgies. Russian princes modeled their capitals on Constantinople, seeing in it a template for Christian kingship. Even in the Islamic world, Byzantine diplomacy and architecture left marks, visible in minarets and mosaics from Damascus to Córdoba. And in the Latin West, sometimes enemy, sometimes student, Byzantium remained a fascination. When Charlemagne crowned himself Emperor of the Romans in 800, it was a challenge to Constantinople's authority, but also an imitation, a recognition, a ghostly acknowledgement that the true throne, the true lineage, still lay on the Bosphorus. By the time of its decline centuries later, Byzantium would be a shadow of its former grandeur, beset by internal strife, Crusader betrayal, Ottoman conquest. But here, in the 6th century, it stands proud, vital, burning with conviction. The last Roman Empire, the first Christian empire, the exception that proves the rule. And even after it falls, after Mehmet's cannons shatter its walls in 1453, the legacy will endure. Orthodox liturgies, legal traditions, preserved manuscripts, artistic techniques. The word Byzantine will come to mean complex, layered, secretive, but also enduring, cultured, refined. Its ghosts will haunt every domed church, every illuminated manuscript, every scholar who opens a tattered Greek text and sees the fire of civilization still flickering within. As you sit now in a quiet courtyard of Constantinople, Listening to the soft murmur of a fountain, you feel the paradox of this empire. Ancient and new, fragile and indestructible, it is not an empire of expansion anymore, but of memory and preservation. It does not conquer the world. It reminds the world what it once was and might be again. Byzantium was not just Rome's heir. It was its reincarnation. Close your eyes, just for a moment. Let the sounds of the past draw near, the chant of monks in candlelit cloisters, the low toll of bells echoing through ruined Roman forums, the quiet whisper of script on parchment. You are no longer seated in the palaces of emperors or riding with generals into battle. You are now in the dim, steady corridors of a faith that outlasted them all. You are in the world of Christianity, a force not of marble and might, but of memory and meaning, a current of continuity flowing through the broken stones of empire. When Rome fell, it did not vanish, nor did it simply surrender to barbarism. In the slow-motion collapse of the Western Empire, one institution, resilient, adaptive, and deeply Roman, remained standing, the Christian Church. As imperial legions vanished from distant provinces and civic buildings crumbled into disuse, the Church endured. Bishops remained in their sees long after imperial governors had fled. Monasteries arose where senatorial estates once ruled. And across the fractured world of post-Roman Europe, churches became not just places of worship but centers of administration, learning, and care. Christianity did not merely survive the fall of Rome, it helped shape what came after. But this transformation was neither inevitable nor simple. At the dawn of the 4th century, Christianity had still been a persecuted minority. The blood of martyrs had soaked the sands of the Colosseum. Christian symbols had been scratched in secret, hidden in catacombs, yet by the early 5th century, it had become the empire's dominant faith. The shift was stunning, from forbidden cult to official creed, from hunted to hegemon. The conversion of Emperor Constantine in the early 300s opened the gates. With the Edict of Milan, persecution ceased. With the Council of Nicaea, doctrine began to crystallize. Under Emperor Theodosius I, Christianity was made the state religion. Pagan temples were shuttered, sacrifices were banned, the old gods were dismissed, not just from the altars, but from the very heart of civic life. This shift had monumental consequences. Religion had once been deeply tied to Roman identity. Every city had its patron deities. Public rituals honored Jupiter, Mars, Venus. To be Roman was to participate in this religious rhythm. Christianity broke that pattern. It introduced a universal God, one who cared not for cities, temples, or civic cults, but for souls, one who promised not glory in battle, but resurrection in death. To many, it seemed an alien intrusion. Some would later blame it outright for Rome's fall. Edward Gibbon, writing in the Enlightenment, famously argued that Christianity weakened the empire's martial virtues, that soldiers who turned their thoughts to heaven no longer fought well on earth. But this is a misreading. Christianity did not sap Rome's strength. It gave birth to a new kind of power. Consider the bishops. In the 5th century, as Western cities struggled with war, famine, and neglect, bishops became de facto rulers. They negotiated with barbarian leaders. They organized food distribution. They even commanded local militias in defense of their flocks. The Bishop of Rome, whom we now call the Pope, emerged as the most powerful figure in the city. Not just spiritually, but politically. Pope Leo I confronted Attila the Hun. Pope Gregory the Great sent missionaries to Anglo-Saxon England. These were not cloistered theologians, they were Roman statesmen investments. This evolution of ecclesiastical authority provided vital continuity. The Church inherited not only the moral authority of Rome, but its administrative framework. Dioceses mirrored the old provincial system. Councils functioned like senates. Latin remained the Church's language, long after it faded from common speech. Even the Church's architectural forms, basilicas, domes, arches, were direct descendants of imperial design. And so, Christianity became the vessel of Rome's memory. Monasteries, those quiet outposts of prayer and penance, became centers of cultural preservation. In scriptoria lit by oil lamps, monks copied not only the Bible and the lives of saints, but the works of Cicero, Virgil, and Aristotle. Without them, much of ancient literature would have vanished. It was monks, not senators, who carried forward Roman learning into the Middle Ages. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written around 530 AD, defined this monastic life. Ora et labora. It urged, pray and work. Benedict envisioned communities of balance, not just spiritual retreat, but centers of labor, charity, and study, in the silence of Monte Cassino or the windswept cells of Iona. Roman culture was gently reborn, not in marble or conquest, but in ink and chant. As the Western Empire collapsed, Christianity also offered a unifying identity. Where once allegiance had been to Rome, now it was to Christ. This mattered immensely in a world of shifting borders and new barbarian kings. The Goths, Vandals, and Lombards all adopted forms of Christianity, initially Arianism. Later Catholicism. Clovis, king of the Franks, embraced Nicene Christianity, aligning himself with the Roman Church and gaining powerful legitimacy. Through this faith, a new order began to emerge. Barbarian rulers claimed descent from Roman emperors. Christian liturgy gave sacred weight to their coronations. Laws were written in Latin, with bishops advising kings. And over it all, the Church maintained a network of authority that transcended local kingdoms. In a world of warlords, bishops spoke with the voice of unity. Christianity also reframed the very meaning of history. Where pagan Rome had celebrated cycles of glory and decline, the Church introduced a linear vision, a story with a beginning, middle, and end. From creation to Judgment Day, history now had purpose. The fall of Rome was not just a tragedy, it was part of a divine plan. Saint Augustine, writing as the empire faltered, offered one of the most profound interpretations. In the City of God, he argued that Rome was never eternal, that its fall mattered little compared to the eternal city of heaven. Earthly empires rise and fall, he said, but the Church endures, guiding souls toward salvation. It was a new kind of triumph, one not won on the battlefield, but in the heart. Yet Christianity was not immune to division. Even in this era of supposed unity, deep theological rifts opened. The Arian controversy split East and West. The Monophysite schism divided Egypt and Syria from Constantinople. Councils were convened, excommunications declared, and through it all, imperial and ecclesiastical power wrestled for control. In the East, emperors often dictated doctrine. In the West, the papacy began to assert its independence. Still, these conflicts did not diminish the Church's role as custodian of Roman legacy. If anything, they revealed its power. Theological debates were not ivory tower disputes, they shaped politics, diplomacy, even war. Bishops were no longer mere shepherds. They were players on the stage of empire. In the centuries to come, this fusion of Roman heritage and Christian faith would give rise to Christendom, a civilization neither fully Roman nor fully medieval. But something new. Cathedrals would rise where temples had stood. Latin chants would echo through lands never touched by Caesar. The Pope would crown emperors. And the idea of Rome would live on, not in walls or legions, but in sacraments, scriptures, and the solemn procession of liturgy. Christianity became, in a real sense, Rome's afterlife. As you drift now into sleep, imagine yourself in a candlelit chapel, its walls ancient, its vaults curved in the style of old basilicas. A choir sings softly. The scent of incense lingers in the air. You feel the weight of centuries pressing gently around you. This is not the end of Rome. It is its metamorphosis. The world has changed. The emperors are gone. The Senate has fallen silent. But the word remains. And in it, Rome breathes still. Listen closely now. As the echoes of empire fade into the long hush of a changing world. The clatter of Roman armor. The proclamations of emperors. The laughter in marble baths. All fall away into silence. What remains is something gentler. More fragile. Yet full of life. A seed planted in the ruins. A new world. Not built in a day. But slowly emerging from the dust and memory of the old. When Rome fell, the earth did not shake. The sky did not darken. There was no thunderous crash. The transformation was quieter, deeper. Beneath the broken aqueducts and crumbling forums. Beneath the emptied villas and overgrown roads. Life went on, changed, smaller, but alive. The Western Roman Empire had been a vast, complex organism, sprawling cities. Legions on the frontiers. Grain fleets from Africa. Silver from Spain. Marble from the east. And then, over a century of upheaval, it unraveled. Provinces slipped away. Armies turned to mercenaries. Trade routes fractured. Emperors vanished into exile or assassination. Yet even as the imperial structure disintegrated, its bones remained in the soil, and in the minds of those who came after. What followed was not simply ruin. It was rearrangement. Across the former western provinces, power devolved to new hands. Gothic kings ruled in Italy. Frankish chieftains in Gaul. Visigothic lords in Spain. These rulers did not style themselves as destroyers. They wanted to inherit Rome, not end it. They wore Roman dress, issued Roman-style laws, hired Roman officials. The dream of empire lingered, even when the empire itself was gone. This desire to preserve Rome, to claim its mantle, shaped the early medieval world in profound ways. Take Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths. He ruled Italy not as a conqueror, but as a Roman. He maintained the Senate, restored aqueducts, appointed Roman administrators. Though Arian in faith, he promoted religious tolerance. His court at Ravenna glowed with mosaics that blended imperial grandeur with Gothic strength. He was both barbarian and Roman, two worlds entwined. In Gaul, Clovis, king of the Franks, converted to Catholic Christianity. In doing so, he aligned himself not only with the Roman Church but with the Roman identity of his subjects. His Merovingian dynasty drew upon both Germanic custom and Roman law. His courts were held in old Roman villas. His nobles read Latin prayers. And yet, his warriors still bore axes and sang songs in Frankish tongues. This was the pattern throughout the West: adaptation, not annihilation. Languages evolved, fusing Latin with local dialects. Institutions changed form, but not always function. Roman villas became monasteries. Pagan temples became churches. Imperial roads now led to pilgrimage sites instead of provincial capitals. The imperial ideal had not died, it had changed clothes. And as political authority fractured, something unexpected blossomed: community. In the absence of centralized power, local bonds deepened. Villages rallied around abbeys. Towns gathered around bishops. Lords swore oaths to kings. Peasants offered labor for protection. The great imperial machine was gone. But in its place rose networks of mutual obligation, of shared faith, of place-based identity. This emerging medieval order was built not on marble, but on wood, not on legions, but on loyalty. And through it all ran the subtle current of transformation. Economically, the scale shrank. Trade diminished, cities contracted, but what survived became more sustainable. Markets focused on local needs. Craftsmen produced for nearby patrons. Farms shifted from export crops to subsistence. There was hardship, yes, but also resilience. Culturally, the world grew quieter. Grand literary salons gave way to scriptoria. Oratory faded, but hymnody thrived. The hero was no longer the senator with eloquence, but the saint with humility. Wisdom came not from rhetoric, but from contemplation. In this new landscape, the church played a central role, as we saw in our last chapter. But beyond theology, it offered a psychological bridge between the old world and the new. To the people of the 6th and 7th centuries, the past was never far. Ruins were everywhere. The vast skeleton of empire surrounded them, in roads, walls, temples, inscriptions. Stories passed down from elders told of emperors, of glory, of a time when Rome ruled all. But instead of mourning that loss, Christian thinkers reframed it. Rome had served its purpose. They said, it had prepared the world for Christ. Its decline was not failure, but fulfillment. Augustine's city of God had replaced the city of men. The glory that once was Rome had been transfigured into the church, into heaven, into eternity. This theological narrative offered comfort. It allowed continuity without despair. It made the past meaningful, even as the present looked so different. Meanwhile, practical continuities persisted. Roman law, codified under Justinian, remained the backbone of legal systems. The corpus juris civilis spread slowly westward, copied and adapted. In the Carolingian Renaissance centuries later, it would find new life, its Latin clauses still echoing across courtrooms. Roman infrastructure, where intact, was used and reused. Bridges repaired, roads cleared. The urban ideal lingered, though cities were smaller. They still held markets, councils, cathedrals. Even Roman timekeeping survived, the calendar, the hours, the habits of scheduling, and of course, the Latin language endured. It faded from peasant speech, but remained the language of learning, law, and liturgy. Through it, Rome whispered to every scholar, every monk, every priest who read from a codex and candlelight. Yet for all this continuity, there was real change. The social order was new. Slavery declined, replaced by serfdom. Status was measured less by office and more by land and lineage. Literacy narrowed to clerical elites. Knowledge transmission slowed, but also deepened. Where the Roman world had been horizontal, connected across vast distances, the medieval world was vertical, layered, rooted, local. And in this new vertical world, a spiritual imagination flourished. The instability of the post-Roman years prompted not just fear, but vision. Prophets, monks, saints, pilgrims, these figures took center stage. They carried dreams of order, of sanctity, of a world more just than the one that had fallen. Hagiographies, the lives of saints, replaced heroic epics. Miracles, not military feats, stirred the hearts of listeners. Heaven grew closer, not as a political metaphor, but as a real and radiant hope. By the late 6th century, a new rhythm of life had taken hold. In Ireland, monasteries flourished in emerald hills, preserving learning in isolation. In Italy, Pope Gregory the Great sent missionaries northward, sparking the Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England. In Francia, kings built chapels beside battlefields. And across the Mediterranean, the Byzantine Empire carried forward an Eastern version of Roman legacy, still vibrant, still imperial, but increasingly Greek and Orthodox in tone. And so, as you listen now beneath the stars of an imagined medieval sky, understand this: the collapse of Rome was not the end. It was a reconfiguration, A world of concrete and columns gave way to one of cloisters and candlelight. Empire became kingdom, senator became bishop, orator became monk, but the core remained: the yearning for order, the respect for law, the pursuit of beauty, the reverence for the divine. It was no longer Rome's world, but it was a world Rome had helped to birth. The catastrophe was real, but so was the transformation. Now breathe slowly. Let the past fade gently into the present. Feel how the pulse of history continues. Steady and soft, like the turning of seasons. What was once broken became reshaped. What was once glorious became sacred. And in that long twilight, a new dawn quietly prepared itself to rise. The wind rustles gently through a field once marked by Roman roads, now overgrown with wildflowers. Stones that once paved the march of legions lie sunken in the earth, their carved inscriptions barely legible beneath moss and time. But listen carefully, beneath the silence, Rome still speaks. Its voice is not heard in trumpet blasts or shouted edicts, but in something more enduring: the steady rhythm of words, the quiet structure of laws, the invisible architecture of identity. In this penultimate chapter of our journey, let us sit by the flickering candlelight of a Benedictine scriptoria, or the echoing stone hall of a Frankish court, and explore the legacy of Roman law, language, and identity, three pillars that would outlast emperors, kingdoms, and even the fall of Rome itself. The law that outlived the empire. Long after the purple robes of emperors disappeared from the western provinces, their laws endured. Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled in the 6th century in Constantinople, was not merely a monument to Roman jurisprudence, it was a lifeline, anchoring legal thought for generations to come. Imagine a Gothic noble in 7th century Italy settling a dispute over land boundaries. His advisors quote laws not written by Goths, but by emperors long dead. Picture a Carolingian scribe in 9th century Gaul copying fragments of Theodosius's decrees in a monastery far from any Roman city. These laws, though once imperial tools, had become intellectual treasures, refined through interpretation, softened by local practice, and gradually absorbed into the legal lifeblood of Europe. But why did Roman law survive? Because it was practical, logical, structured. The Romans did not merely command, they codified. Property, contracts, family, inheritance, crime. Every domain of life was touched by this organized vision of justice. And for societies emerging from the collapse of centralized imperial rule, it offered a sense of continuity, a scaffolding of stability. In many successor kingdoms, Visigothic Spain, Frankish Gaul, Lombard Italy, Roman law was not abolished. Instead, it coexisted with the new ruler's own legal customs. A dual system emerged: Romans judged by Roman law, Germans by their tribal codes. Over time, the lines blurred. The laws began to influence each other. And by the 9th century, a hybrid legal consciousness had taken root. In the East, under the Byzantines, Roman law remained the official standard, updated and refined in new legal manuals. In the West, its legacy waited like dormant seeds, ready to bloom centuries later in medieval universities and Enlightenment philosophy. And so, the fall of Rome did not mark the death of its law, but its diffusion. Like the spreading of ink across a parchment, quiet, gradual, indelible, the echo of Latin. In a Frankish village chapel, a priest raises his voice in a language the people only partly understand. It is Latin, no longer the speech of everyday life, but the sacred tongue of law, prayer, and power. As the Roman Empire fractured, its spoken Latin also evolved, breaking into the early forms of French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. Yet, even as the vernaculars grew, Latin endured. It became the language of the church, of diplomacy, of learned men and women. In dusty libraries and cloistered monasteries, monks copied Virgil and Cicero alongside scripture. Roman thought, its poetry, its philosophy, its rhetoric, was preserved not because Rome had survived, but because Latin had become the bridge between the ancient and the medieval. Even kings who spoke Frankish or Gothic insisted their laws and treaties be written in Latin. It was the language that dignified authority, that connected them to an older legitimacy. A ruler could claim to be a Christian king, but to speak Latin in his decrees was to also speak, implicitly, with the voice of empire. Consider this. While the physical city of Rome fell into ruin, its language became the common intellectual currency of Europe. A monk in Ireland could write to a scholar in Italy, and both would understand each other through this shared inheritance. It was not a perfect Latin, often called Church Latin or Medieval Latin, but it was alive, changing, adaptable. Just as Roman law had fused with tribal customs, so too did Latin adapt to the New World, carrying with it fragments of the Old. To learn Latin in the 9th century was to claim a heritage, not merely linguistic, but civilizational. It reminded all who used it that they stood on the shoulders of giants, even if those giants had long since fallen into the shadows of time. Who were the Romans now? But if law and language survived, what of identity? Who, after the fall, could still claim to be Roman? It's a question without a single answer. And therein lies its power. In some places, like southern Gaul or parts of Italy, elite families still proudly called themselves Romans, even as they served Gothic or Frankish rulers. Their houses bore mosaics of classical gods beside Christian symbols. Their sons studied Latin and read Livy and Augustine in equal measure. In their minds, Rome had not fallen, it had simply adapted. In other regions, Roman became more myth than reality, a symbol of lost order. A cultural memory invoked by kings seeking legitimacy. Charlemagne would crown himself Emperor of the Romans in 800 AD. Despite having no Roman blood, the Byzantines, meanwhile, still called themselves Romoi, Romans, even 1,000 years after the Western Empire had collapsed. To them, the empire lived in Constantinople, not the ruins of the Forum. And then there were those for whom Roman meant Christian. The Church had baptized the empire's identity, reshaping it into a spiritual authority. As one bishop in Gaul told us earlier, Christ now reigns where Caesar once ruled. Romanitas had shifted from geography to theology. So, who were the Romans? A noble in Ravenna, a scribe in Toledo, a bishop in Arles, a monk in Monte Cassino, a merchant quoting contracts in Latin, a Byzantine general commanding troops in Armenia. All different, yet all bound, somehow, by threads spun in an empire that no longer held physical sway. Rome became not a place, but an idea, a memory, a standard, and it is perhaps in this transformation, from tangible power to intangible ideal, that Rome achieved a greater immortality than any city or emperor ever could. The Roman inheritance. As we stand on the edge of the Middle Ages, looking back across the long shadow cast by Rome, we see that what the empire truly bequeathed was not marble columns or golden coins, but a cultural toolkit, law to order society, language to connect minds, and identity to bind generations. These tools would be used, and reused, for centuries. They would be broken down and rebuilt. Sometimes misused, sometimes misunderstood, but always present, like echoes in a deep chamber. In the Renaissance, Latin would rise again in art and science. Roman law would underpin the legal systems of kingdoms, republics, and modern nations. The dream of a Roman order would inspire emperors and popes alike. Even today, in our governments, in our languages, in our sense of justice and citizenship. Rome lives on. This is the hidden triumph of the Roman world, not in military victory or imperial borders, but in its capacity to shape the invisible architecture of civilization. The fall of Odoacer, the rise of Theodoric, these were turning points. But beneath the clash of swords and the rise of kings, the deeper story was already unfolding, the survival of ideas. A quiet flame. Let us end this chapter not in a battlefield or a throne room, but in a quiet garden. A Benedictine monk sits beneath a cypress tree, copying a line from Cicero. He dips his quill in ink and carefully traces the letters, preserving words written 1,000 years before. In the distance, a bell tolls. The sky turns lavender. Somewhere, a Gothic warlord holds court. Elsewhere, a bishop writes a sermon. A Frankish king receives a papal emissary. A Visigothic lawyer consults a legal codex. All of them, consciously or not, live in Rome's shadow. Not as subjects of an emperor, but as inheritors of a legacy. They do not need Roman banners or legions. They carry something deeper, the law, the language, and the idea that civilization can endure. And in the flicker of that candle, in the whisper of that pen, in the quiet breath of continuity, Rome lives still.